This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.R. Dobbs. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 26. These limbs are strengthened with a soldier's toil, nor has this cheek ever blanched with fear. But this sad tale of thine enervates all within me that I once could boast as man. Chill trembling agues seize upon my frame, and tears of childish sorrow pour apace through scarred channels that were marked by wounds. Duo. The friends of Henry Wharton had placed so much reliance on his innocence that they were unable to see the full danger of his situation. As the moment of trial, however, approached, the uneasiness of the youth himself increased, and after spending most of the night with his afflicted family, he awoke on the following morning from a short and disturbed slumber to a clearer sense of his condition and a survey of the means that were to extricate him from it with life. The rank of André and the importance of the measures he was plotting, together with the powerful intercessions that had been made in his behalf, occasioned his execution to be stamped with greater notoriety than the ordinary events of the war. But spies were frequently arrested, and the instances that occurred of summary punishment for this crime were numerous. These were facts that were well known to both Dunwoodie and the prisoner, and to their experienced judgments the preparations for the trial were indeed alarming. Notwithstanding their apprehensions, they succeeded so far in concealing them that neither Miss Peyton nor Frances was aware of their extent. A strong guard was stationed in the outbuilding of the farmhouse where the prisoner was quartered, and several sentinels watched the avenues that approached the dwelling. Another was constantly near the room of the British officer. A court was already detailed to examine into the circumstances, and upon their decision the fate of Henry rested. The moment at length arrived, and the different actors in the approaching investigation assembled. Frances experienced a feeling like suffocation, as, after taking her seat in the midst of her family, her eyes wandered over the group who were thus collected. The judges, 3 in number, sat by themselves, clad in the vestments of their profession, and maintained a gravity worthy of the occasion and becoming in their rank. In the center was a man of advanced years, and whose whole exterior bore the stamp of early and long-tried military habits. This was the president of the court, and Frances, after taking a hasty and unsatisfactory view of his associates, turned to his benevolent countenance as to the harbinger of mercy to her brother. There was a melting and subdued expression in the features of the veteran that, contrasted with the rigid decency and composure of the others, could not fail to attract her notice. His attire was strictly in conformity to the prescribed rules of the service to which he belonged, but while his air was erect and military, his fingers trifled with a kind of convulsive and unconscious motion with a bit of crape that entwined the hilt of the sword on which his body partly reclined, and which, like himself, seemed a relic of older times. There were the workings of an unquiet soul within, but his military front blended with awe the pity that its exhibition excited. His associates were officers selected from the eastern troops who held the fortresses of West Point and the adjacent passes. They were men who had attained the meridian of life, and the eye sought in vain the expression of any passion or emotion on which it might seize as an indication of human infirmity. In their demeanor there was a mild but a grave intellectual reserve. If there was no ferocity nor harshness to chill, neither was there compassion nor interest to attract. They were men who had long acted under the dominion of a prudent reason, and whose feelings seemed trained to a perfect submission to their judgments. Before these arbiters of his fate, Henry Wharton was ushered under the custody of armed men. A profound and awful silence succeeded his entrance, and the blood of Frances chilled as she noted the grave character of the whole proceedings. There was but little of pomp in the preparations to impress her imagination, but the reserved, businesslike air of the whole scene made it seem indeed as if the destinies of life awaited the result. Two of the judges sat in grave reserve, fixing their inquiring eyes on the object of their investigation; but the president continued gazing around with uneasy, convulsive motions of the muscles of the face that indicated a restlessness foreign to his years and duty. It was Colonel Singleton, who but the day before had learned the fate of Isabella, and who stood forth in the discharge of a duty that his country required at his hands. The silence and the expectation in every eye at length struck him, and making an effort to collect himself, he spoke in the tones of one used to authority. "Bring forth the prisoner," he said, with a wave of the hand. The sentinels dropped the points of their bayonets towards the judges, and Henry Wharton advanced with a firm step into the center of the apartment. All was now anxiety and eager curiosity. Frances turned for a moment in grateful emotion, as the deep and perturbed breathing of Dunwoodie reached her ears; but her brother again concentrated all her interest in one feeling of intense care. In the background were arranged the inmates of the family who owned the dwelling, and behind them again was a row of shining faces of ebony, glistening with pleased wonder. Amongst these was the faded luster of Caesar Thompson's countenance. "You are said," continued the president, "to be Henry Wharton, a captain in his Britannic Majesty's 60th Regiment of Foot." "I am." "I like your candor, sir. It partakes of the honorable feelings of a soldier, and cannot fail to impress your judges favorably." "It would be prudent," said one of his companions, "to advise the prisoner that he is bound to answer no more than he deems necessary. Although we are a court of martial law, yet, in this respect, we own the principles of all free governments." A nod of approbation from the silent member was bestowed on this remark, and the president proceeded with caution, referring to the minutes he held in his hand. "It is an accusation against you, that, being an officer of the enemy, you passed the pickets of the American army at the White Plains in disguise, on the 29th of October last, whereby you are suspected of views hostile to the interests of America, and have subjected yourself to the punishment of a spy." The mild but steady tones of the speaker, as he slowly repeated the substance of this charge, were full of authority. The accusation was so plain, the facts so limited, the proof so obvious, and the penalty so well established, that escape seemed impossible. But Henry replied, with earnest grace, "That I passed your pickets in disguise is true, but—" "Peace!" interrupted the president. "The usages of war are stern enough in themselves. You need not aid them to your own condemnation." "The prisoner can retract that declaration if he please," remarked another judge. "His confession, if taken, goes fully to prove the charge." "I retract nothing that is true," said Henry, proudly. The two nameless judges heard him in silent composure, yet there was no exultation mingled with their gravity. The president now appeared, however, to take new interest in the scene. "Your sentiment is noble, sir," he said. "I only regret that a youthful soldier should so far be misled by loyalty as to lend himself to the purposes of deceit." "Deceit!" echoed Wharton. "I thought it prudent to guard against capture from my enemies." "A soldier, Captain Wharton, should never meet his enemy but openly, and with arms in his hands. I have served two kings of England, as I now serve my native land, but never did I approach a foe, unless under light of the sun, and with honest notice that an enemy was nigh." "You are at liberty to explain what your motives were in entering the ground held by our army in disguise," said the other judge, with a slight movement of the muscles of his mouth. "I am the son of this aged man before you," continued Henry. "It was to visit him that I encountered the danger, Besides, the country below is seldom held by your troops, and its very name implies a right to either party to move at pleasure over its territory." "Its name, as a neutral ground, is unauthorized by law. It is an appellation that originates with the condition of the country; but wherever an army goes, it carries its rights along, and the first is the ability to protect itself." "I am no casuist, sir," returned the youth, "but I feel that my father is entitled to my affection, and I would encounter greater risks to prove it to him in his old age." "A very commendable spirit," cried the veteran. "Come, gentlemen, this business brightens. I confess at first it was very bad, but no man can censure him for desiring to see his parents." "And have you proof that such only was your intention?" "Yes, here," said Henry, admitting a ray of hope. "Here is proof. My father, my sister, Major Dunwoodie, all know it." "Then, indeed," returned his immovable judge, "we may be able to save you. It would be well, sir, to examine further into this business." "Certainly," said the president with alacrity. "Let the elder Mr. Wharton approach and take the oath." The father made an effort at composure, and advancing with a feeble step, he complied with the necessary forms of the court. "You are the father of the prisoner?" said Colonel Singleton in a subdued voice, after pausing a moment in respect for the agitation of the witness. "He is my only son." "And what do you know of his visit to your house on the 29th day of October last?" "He came, as he told you, to see me and his sisters." "Was he in disguise?" asked the other judge. "He did not wear the uniform of the 60th." "To see his sisters, too," said the president, with great emotion. "Have you daughters, sir?" "I have two. Both are in this house." "Had he a wig?" interrupted the officer. "There was some such thing, I do believe, upon his head." "And how long had you been separated?" asked the president. 1 year and 2 months." "Did he wear a loose greatcoat of coarse materials?" inquired the officer, referring to the paper that contained the charges. "There was an overcoat." "And you think that it was to see you only that he came out?" "Me and my daughters." "A boy of spirit," whispered the president to his silent comrade. "I see but little harm in such a freak. 'Twas imprudent, but then it was kind." "Do you know that your son was entrusted with no commission from Sir Henry Clinton, and that the visit to you was not merely a cloak to other designs?" "How can I know it?" said Mr. Wharton, in alarm. "Would Sir Henry entrust me with such a business?" "Know you anything of this pass?" exhibiting the paper that Dunwoodie had retained when Wharton was taken. "Nothing, upon my honor, nothing," cried the father, shrinking from the paper as from contagion. "On your oath?" "Nothing." "Have you other testimony? This does not avail you, Captain Wharton. You have been taken in a situation where your life is forfeited. The labor of proving your innocence rests with yourself. Take time to reflect, and be cool." There was a frightful calmness in the manner of this judge that appalled the prisoner. In the sympathy of Colonel Singleton, he could easily lose sight of his danger, but the obdurate and collected air of the others was ominous of his fate. He continued silent, casting imploring glances towards his friend. Dunwoodie understood the appeal, and offered himself as a witness. He was sworn, and desired to relate what he knew. His statement did not materially alter the case, and Dunwoodie felt that it could not. To him personally but little was known, and that little rather militated against the safety of Henry than otherwise. His account was listened to in silence, and the significant shake of the head that was made by the silent member spoke too plainly what effect it had produced. "Still you think that the soldier had no other object than what he has avowed?" said the president, when he had ended. "None other. I will pledge my life," cried the major, with fervor. "Will you swear it?" asked the immovable judge. "How can I? God alone can tell the heart. But I have known this gentleman from a boy. Deceit never formed part of his character. He is above it." "You say that he was escaped, and was retaken in open arms," said the president. "He was. Nay, he received a wound in the combat. You see he yet moves his arm with difficulty. Would he, think you, sir, have trusted himself where he could fall again into our hands unless conscious of innocence?" "Would André have deserted a field of battle, Major Dunwoodie, had he encountered such an event near Tarrytown?" asked his deliberate examiner. "Is it not natural to youth to seek glory?" "Do you call this glory?" exclaimed the major. "An ignominious death and a tarnished name?" "Major Dunwoodie," returned the other, still with inveterate gravity, "you have acted nobly. Your duty has been arduous and severe, but it has been faithfully and honorably discharged. Ours must not be less so." During the examination, the most intense interest prevailed among the hearers. With that kind of feeling which could not separate the principle from the cause, most of the auditors thought that if Dunwoodie failed to move the hearts of Henry's judges, no other possessed the power. Caesar thrust his misshapen form forward, and his features, so expressive of the concern he felt, and so different from the vacant curiosity pictured in the countenance of the other blacks, caught the attention of the silent judge. For the first time he spoke. "Let that black be brought forward." It was too late to retreat, and Caesar found himself confronted with a row of rebel officers before he knew what was uppermost in his thoughts. The others yielded the examination to the one who suggested it, and using all due deliberation, he proceeded accordingly. "You know the prisoner?" "I think he ought," returned the black, in a manner as sententious as that of his examiner. "Did he give you the wig when he threw it aside?" "I don't want 'em," grumbled Caesar. "Got a very good hair self." "Were you employed in carrying any letters or messages of any kind while Captain Wharton was in your master's house?" "I do what 'a tell me," returned the black. "But what did they tell you to do?" "Sometime a one ting, sometime another." "Enough," said Colonel Singleton, with dignity. "You have the noble acknowledgment of a gentleman. What more can you obtain from this slave? Captain Wharton, you perceive the unfortunate impression against you. Have you other testimony to adduce?" To Henry there now remained but little hope. His confidence in his security was fast ebbing. But with an indefinite expectation of assistance from the loveliness of his sister, he fixed an earnest gaze on the pallid features of Frances. She arose, and with a tottering step moved towards the judges. The paleness of her cheek continued but for a moment, and gave place to a flush of fire, and with a light but firm tread she stood before them. Raising her hand to her polished forehead, Frances threw aside her exuberant locks, and displayed a picture of beauty and innocence to their view that might have moved even sterner natures. The president shrouded his eyes for a moment, as if the wild eye and speaking countenance recalled the image of another. The movement was transient, and recovering himself with an earnestness that betrayed his secret wishes, "To you, then, your brother previously communicated his intention of paying your family a secret visit?" "No, no," said Frances, pressing her hand on her brain as if to collect her thoughts. "He told me nothing. We knew naught of the visit until he arrived. But can it be necessary to explain to gallant men that a child would incur hazard to meet his only parent, and that in times like these, and in a situation like ours?" "But was this the first time? Did he never even talk of doing so before?" inquired the colonel, leaning towards her with paternal interest. "Certainly, certainly," cried Frances, catching the expression of his own benevolent countenance. "This is but the fourth of his visits. I knew it!" exclaimed the veteran, rubbing his hands with delight. "An adventurous, warm-hearted son! I warrant me, gentlemen, a fiery soldier in the field. In what disguises did he come?" "In none, for none were then necessary. The royal troops covered the country, and gave him safe passage." "And was this the first of his visits out of the uniform of his regiment?" asked the colonel, in a suppressed voice, avoiding the penetrating looks of his companions. "Oh, the very first!" exclaimed the eager girl. "His first offense, I do assure you, if offense it be." "But you wrote him, you urged the visit? Surely, young lady, you wished to see your brother?" added the impatient colonel. "That we wished it, and prayed for it, oh, how fervently we prayed for it, is true; but to have held communion with the royal army would have endangered our father, and we dared not." "Did he leave the house until taken, or had he intercourse with any out of your own dwelling?" "With none, no one, excepting our neighbor, the peddler, Birch." "With whom?" exclaimed the colonel, turning pale, and shrinking as from the sting of an adder. Dunwoodie groaned aloud, and striking his head with his hand, cried in piercing tones, "He is lost!" and rushed from the apartment. "But Harvey Birch?" repeated Frances, gazing wildly at the door, through which her lover had disappeared. "Harvey Birch!" echoed all the judges. The two immovable members of the court exchanged looks, and threw an inquisitive glance at the prisoner. "To you, gentlemen, it can be no new intelligence to hear that Harvey Birch is suspected of favoring the royal cause," said Henry, again advancing before the judges, "for he has already been condemned by your tribunals to the fate that I now see awaits myself. I will therefore explain. It was by his assistance I procured the disguise and passed your pickets; but to my dying moments, and with my dying breath, I will avow that my intentions were as pure as the innocent being before you." "Captain Wharton," said the president, solemnly, "the enemies of American liberty have made mighty and subtle efforts to overthrow our power. A more dangerous man, for his means and education, is not ranked among our foes than this peddler of Westchester. He is a spy, artful, delusive, and penetrating, beyond the abilities of any of his class. Sir Henry could not do better than to associate him with the officer in his next attempt. He would have saved André. Indeed, young man, this is a connection that may prove fatal to you." The honest indignation that beamed on the countenance of the aged warrior was met by a look of perfect conviction on the part of his comrades. "I have ruined him!" cried Frances, clasping her hands in terror. "Do you desert us? Then he is lost indeed." "Forbear, lovely innocent, forbear," said the colonel, with strong emotion. "You injure none, but distress us all." "Is it then such a crime to possess natural affection?" said Frances, wildly. "Would Washington, the noble, upright, impartial Washington, judge so harshly? Delay till Washington can hear his tale." "It is impossible," said the president, covering his eyes as if to hide her beauty from his view. "Impossible! Oh, but for a week suspend your judgment, on my knees, I entreat you, as you will expect mercy yourself when no human power can avail you. Give him but a day." "It is impossible," repeated the colonel, in a voice that was nearly choked. "Our orders are peremptory, and too long delay has been given already." He turned from the kneeling suppliant, but could not, or would not, extricate that hand that she grasped with frenzied fervor. "Remand your prisoner," said one of the judges to the officer who had the charge of Henry. "Colonel Singleton, shall we withdraw?" "Singleton! Singleton!" echoed Frances. "Then you are a father, and know how to pity a father's woes. You cannot, will not, wound a heart that is now nearly crushed. Hear me, Colonel Singleton, as God will listen to your dying prayers. Hear me, and spare my brother." "Remove her," said the colonel, gently endeavoring to extricate his hand. but none appeared disposed to obey. Frances eagerly strove to read the expression of his averted face, and resisted all his efforts to retire. "Colonel Singleton, how lately was your own son in suffering and in danger! Under the roof of my father he was cherished; under my father's roof he found shelter and protection. Oh, suppose that son, the pride of your age, the solace and protection of your infant children, and then pronounce my brother guilty, if you dare. What right has Heath to make an executioner of me?" exclaimed the veteran fiercely, rising with a face flushed like fire, and every vein and artery swollen with suppressed emotion. "But I forget myself. Come, gentlemen, let us mount. Our painful duty must be done." "Mount not! Go not!" shrieked Frances. "Can you tear a son from his parent, a brother from his sister, so coldly? Is this the cause I have so ardently loved? Are these the men that I have been taught to reverence? But you relent, you do hear me, you will pity and forgive." "Lead on, gentlemen," said the colonel, motioning towards the door, and erecting himself into an air of military grandeur, in the vain hope of quieting his feelings. "Lead not on, but hear me," cried Frances, grasping his hand convulsively. "Colonel Singleton, you are a father. Pity, mercy, mercy for the son, mercy for the daughter. Yes, you had a daughter. On this bosom she poured out her last breath. These hands closed her eyes. These very hands, that are now clasped in prayer, did those offices for her that you condemn my poor, poor brother to require." One mighty emotion the veteran struggled with and quelled, but with a groan that shook his whole frame. He even looked around in conscious pride at his victory, but a second burst of feeling conquered. His head, white with the frost of 70 winters, sank upon the shoulder of the frantic suppliant. The sword that had been his companion in so many fields of blood dropped from his nerveless hand as he cried, "May God bless you for the deed!" He wept aloud. Long and violent was the indulgence that Colonel Singleton yielded to his feelings. On recovering, he gave the senseless Frances into the arms of her aunt, and turning with an air of fortitude to his comrades, he said, "Still, gentlemen, we have our duty as officers to discharge. Our feelings as men may be indulged hereafter. What is your pleasure with the prisoner?" One of the judges placed in his hand a written sentence that he had prepared while the colonel was engaged with Frances, and declared it to be the opinion of himself and his companion. It briefly stated that Henry Wharton had been detected in passing the lines of the American army as a spy and in disguise; that thereby, according to the laws of war, he was liable to suffer death, and that this court adjudged him to the penalty, recommending him to be executed by hanging before 9 o'clock on the following morning. It was not usual to inflict capital punishments, even on the enemy, without referring the case to the commander-in-chief for his approbation, or in his absence to the officer commanding for the time being; but as Washington held his headquarters at New Windsor, on the western bank of the Hudson, there was sufficient time to receive his answer. "This is short notice," said the veteran, holding the pen in his hand, in a suspense that had no object. "Not a day to fit one so young for heaven?" "The royal officers gave Hale but an hour," returned his comrade. [Footnote: An American officer of this name was detected within the British lines in disguise, in search of military information. He was tried and executed, as stated in the text, as soon as the preparations could be made. It is said that he was reproached under the gallows with dishonoring the rank he held by his fate. "What a death for an officer to die!" said one of his captors. "Gentlemen, any death is honorable when a man dies in a cause like that of America," was his answer. André was executed amid the tears of his enemies. Hale died unpitied and with reproaches in his ears, and yet one was the victim of ambition, and the other of devotion to his country. Posterity will do justice between them. End footnote. We have granted the usual time, but Washington has the power to extend it or to pardon. "Then to Washington I will go," cried the colonel, returning the paper with his signature, "and if the services of an old man like me, or that brave boy of mine, entitle me to his ear, I will yet save the youth." So saying, he departed, full of his generous intentions in favor of Henry Wharton. The sentence of the court was communicated with proper tenderness to the prisoner, and after giving a few necessary instructions to the officer in command, and dispatching a courier to headquarters with their report, the remaining judges mounted and rode to their own quarters, with the same unmoved exterior, but with the consciousness of the same dispassionate integrity that they had maintained throughout the trial. End of chapter 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.R. Dobbs, San Francisco. The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 27. Have you no countermand for Claudio yet, but he must die tomorrow? Measure for Measure. A few hours were passed by the prisoner, after his sentence was received, in the bosom of his family. Mr. Wharton wept in hopeless despondency over the untimely fate of his son, and Frances, after recovering from her insensibility, experienced an anguish of feeling to which the bitterness of death itself would have been comparatively light. Miss Peyton alone retained a vestige of hope or presence of mind to suggest what might be proper to be done under their circumstances. The comparative composure of the good aunt arose in no degree from any want of interest in the welfare of her nephew, but it was founded in a kind of instinctive dependence on the character of Washington. He was a native of the same colony with herself, and although his early military services, and her frequent visits to the family of her sister, and subsequent establishment at its head, had prevented their ever meeting, still she was familiar with his domestic virtues, and well knew that the rigid inflexibility for which his public acts were distinguished formed no part of his reputation in private life. He was known in Virginia as a consistent but just and lenient master, and she felt a kind of pride in associating in her mind her countryman with the man who led the armies, and in a great measure controlled the destinies of America. She knew that Henry was innocent of the crime for which he was condemned to suffer, and with that kind of simple faith that is ever to be found in the most ingenuous characters, could not conceive of those constructions and interpretations of law that inflicted punishment without the actual existence of crime. But even her confiding hopes were doomed to meet with a speedy termination. Towards noon, a regiment of militia, that were quartered on the banks of the river, moved to the ground in front of the house that held our heroine and her family, and deliberately pitched their tents, with the avowed intention of remaining until the following morning, to give solemnity and effect to the execution of a British spy. Dunwoodie had performed all that was required of him by his orders, and was at liberty to retrace his steps to his expectant squadron, which was impatiently waiting his return to be led against a detachment of the enemy that was known to be slowly moving up the banks of the river, in order to cover a party of foragers in its rear. He was accompanied by a small party of Lawton's troop, under the expectation that their testimony might be required to convict the prisoner, and Mason, the lieutenant, was in command. But the confession of Captain Wharton had removed the necessity of examining any witnesses on behalf of the people. Footnote: in America, justice is administered in the name of the good people, etc., etc., the sovereignty residing with them. End footnote. The major, from an unwillingness to encounter the distress of Henry's friends, and a dread of trusting himself within its influence, had spent the time we have mentioned in walking by himself, in keen anxiety, at a short distance from the dwelling. Like Miss Peyton, he had some reliance on the mercy of Washington, although moments of terrific doubt and despondency were continually crossing his mind. To him the rules of service were familiar, and he was more accustomed to consider his general in the capacity of a ruler than as exhibiting the characteristics of the individual. A dreadful instance had too recently occurred, which fully proved that Washington was above the weakness of sparing another in mercy to himself. While pacing with hurried steps through the orchard, laboring under these constantly recurring doubts, enlivened by transient rays of hope, Mason approached, accoutred completely for the saddle. "Thinking you might have forgotten the news brought this morning from below, sir, I have taken the liberty to order the detachment under arms," said the lieutenant, very coolly, cutting down with his sheathed saber the mullein tops that grew within his reach. "What news?" cried the major, starting. "Only that John Bull is out in Westchester with a train of wagons, which, if he fills, will compel us to retire through these cursed hills in search of provender. These greedy Englishmen are so shut up on York Island, that when they do venture out, they seldom leave straw enough to furnish the bed of a Yankee heiress." "Where did the express leave them, did you say? The intelligence has entirely escaped my memory." "On the heights above Sing Sing," returned the lieutenant, with no little amazement. "The road below looks like a haymarket, and all the swine are sighing forth their lamentations as the corn passes them towards King's Bridge. George Singleton's orderly, who brought up the tidings, says that our horses were holding consultation if they should not go down without their riders and eat another meal, for it is questionable with them whether they can get a full stomach again. If they are suffered to get back with their plunder, we shall not be able to find a piece of pork at Christmas fat enough to fry itself." "Peace with all this nonsense of Singleton's orderly, Mr. Mason," cried Dunwoodie, impatiently. "Let him learn to wait the orders of his superiors." "I beg pardon in his name, Major Dunwoodie," said the subaltern; "but, like myself, he was in error. We both thought it was the order of General Heath to attack and molest the enemy whenever he ventured out of his nest." "Recollect yourself, Lieutenant Mason," said the major, "or I may have to teach you that your orders pass through me." "I know it, Major Dunwoodie, I know it, and I am sorry that your memory is so bad as to forget that I never have yet hesitated to obey them." "Forgive me, Mason," cried Dunwoodie, taking both his hands. "I do know you for a brave and obedient soldier. Forget my humor. But this business—had you ever a friend—" "Nay, nay," interrupted the lieutenant, "forgive me in my honest zeal. I knew of the orders, and was fearful that censure might fall on my officer. But remain, and let a man breathe a syllable against the corps, and every sword will start from the scabbard of itself. Besides, they are still moving up, and it is a long road from Croton to King's Bridge. Happen what may, I see plainly that we shall be on their heels before they are housed again." "Oh, that the courier was returned from headquarters!" exclaimed Dunwoodie. "This suspense is insupportable." "You have your wish," cried Mason. "Here he is at the moment, and riding like the bearer of good news. God send it may be so, for I can't say that I particularly like myself to see a brave young man dancing upon nothing." Dunwoodie heard but very little of this feeling declaration, for ere half of it was uttered, he had leaped the fence and stood before the messenger. "What news?" cried the major, the moment that the soldier stopped his horse. "Good!" exclaimed the man; and feeling no hesitation to entrust an officer so well known as Major Dunwoodie, he placed the paper in his hands, as he added, "But you can read it, sir, for yourself." Dunwoodie paused not to read, but flew with the elastic spring of joy to the chamber of the prisoner. The sentinel knew him, and he was suffered to pass without question. "Oh, Peyton!" cried Frances, as he entered the apartment, "you look like a messenger from heaven. Bring you tidings of mercy?" "Here, Frances; here, Henry; here, dear cousin Jeanette," cried the youth, as with trembling hands he broke the seal. "Here is the letter itself, directed to the captain of the guard. But listen." All did listen with intense anxiety, and the pang of blasted hope was added to their misery, as they saw the glow of delight which had beamed on the countenance of the major give place to a look of horror. The page contained the sentence of the court, and underneath was written these simple words: "Approved, George Washington." "He's lost! He's lost!" cried Frances, sinking into the arms of her aunt. My son," sobbed the father. There is mercy in heaven if there is none on earth. May Washington never want that mercy he thus denies to my innocent child." "Washington!" echoed Dunwoodie, gazing around him in vacant horror. "Yes, 'tis the act of Washington himself. These are his characters. His very name is here to sanction the dreadful deed." "Cruel, cruel Washington!" cried Miss Peyton. "How has familiarity with blood changed his nature!" "Blame him not," said Dunwoodie. "It is the general, and not the man, my life on it. He feels the blow he is compelled to inflict." "I have been deceived in him," cried Frances. "He is not the savior of his country, but a cold and merciless tyrant. Oh, Peyton, Peyton, how have you misled me in his character?" "Peace, dear Frances, peace, for God's sake. Use not such language. He is but the guardian of the law." "You speak the truth, Major Dunwoodie," said Henry, recovering from the shock of having his last ray of hope extinguished, and advancing from his seat by the side of his father. "I, who am to suffer, blame him not. Every indulgence has been granted me that I can ask. On the verge of the grave, I cannot continue unjust at such a moment, with so recent an instance of danger to your cause from treason. I wonder not at Washington's unbending justice. Nothing now remains but to prepare for that fate which so speedily awaits me. To you, Major Dunwoodie, I make my first request." "Name it," said the major, giving utterance with difficulty. Henry turned, and pointing to the group of weeping mourners near him, he continued,— "Be a son to this aged man. Help his weakness, and defend him from any usage to which the stigma thrown upon me may subject him. He has not many friends amongst the rulers of this country. Let your powerful name be found among them." "It shall." "And this helpless innocent," continued Henry, pointing to where Sarah sat, unconscious of what was passing, "I had hoped for an opportunity to revenge her wrongs." A flush of excitement passed over his features. "But such thoughts are evil. I feel them to be wrong. Under your care, Peyton, she will find sympathy and refuge." "She shall," whispered Dunwoodie. "This good aunt has claims upon you already. Of her I will not speak. But here," taking the hand of Frances, and dwelling upon her countenance with an expression of fraternal affection, "here is the choicest gift of all. Take her to your bosom, and cherish her as you would cultivate innocence and virtue." The major could not repress the eagerness with which he extended his hand to receive the precious boon; but Frances, shrinking from his touch, hid her face in the bosom of her aunt. "No, no, no," she murmured. "None can ever be anything to me who aid in my brother's destruction." Henry continued gazing at her in tender pity for several moments, before he again resumed a discourse that all felt was most peculiarly his own. "I have been mistaken, then. I did think, Peyton, that your worth, your noble devotion to a cause that you have been taught to revere, that your kindness to our father when in imprisonment, your friendship for me, in short, that your character was understood and valued by my sister." "It is, it is," whispered Frances, burying her face still deeper in the bosom of her aunt. "I believe, dear Henry," said Dunwoodie, "this is a subject that had better not be dwelt upon now." "You forget," returned the prisoner, with a faint smile, "how much I have to do, and how little time is left to do it in." "I apprehend," continued the major, with a face of fire, "that Miss Wharton has imbibed some opinions of me that would make a compliance with your request irksome to her, opinions that it is now too late to alter." "No, no, no," cried Frances quickly. "You are exonerated, Peyton. With her dying breath, she removed my doubts." "Generous Isabella!" murmured Dunwoodie. "But still, Henry, spare your sister now; nay, spare even me." "I speak in pity to myself," returned the brother, gently removing Frances from the arms of her aunt. "What a time is this to leave two such lovely females without a protector! Their abode is destroyed, and misery will speedily deprive them of their last male friend," looking at his father. "Can I die in peace with the knowledge of the danger to which they will be exposed?" "You forget me," said Miss Peyton, shrinking at the idea of celebrating nuptials at such a moment. "No, my dear aunt, I forget you not, nor shall I, until I cease to remember; but you forget the times and the danger. The good woman who lives in this house has already dispatched a messenger for a man of God, to smooth my passage to another world. Frances, if you would wish me to die in peace, to feel a security that will allow me to turn my whole thoughts to heaven, you will let this clergyman unite you to Dunwoodie." Frances shook her head, but remained silent. "I ask for no joy, no demonstration of a felicity that you will not, cannot feel, for months to come, but obtain a right to this powerful name, give him an undisputed title to protect you." Again the maid made an impressive gesture of denial. "For the sake of that unconscious sufferer," pointing to Sarah, "for your sake, for my sake, my sister—" "Peace, Henry, or you will break my heart," cried the agitated girl. "Not for worlds would I at such a moment engage in the solemn vows that you wish. It would render me miserable for life." "You love him not," said Henry, reproachfully. "I cease to importune you to do what is against your inclinations." Frances raised one hand to conceal her countenance, as she extended the other towards Dunwoodie, and said earnestly, "Now you are unjust to me; before, you were unjust to yourself." "Promise me, then," said Wharton, musing a while in silence, "that as soon as the recollection of my fate is softened, you will give my friend that hand for life, and I am satisfied." "I do promise," said Frances, withdrawing the hand that Dunwoodie delicately relinquished, without even presuming to press it to his lips. "Well, then, my good aunt," continued Henry, "will you leave me for a short time alone with my friend? I have a few melancholy commissions with which to entrust him, and would spare you and my sister the pain of hearing them." "There is yet time to see Washington again," said Miss Peyton, moving towards the door; and then, speaking with extreme dignity, she continued, "I will go myself. Surely he must listen to a woman from his own colony, and we were in some degree connected with his family." "Why not apply to Mr. Harper?" said Frances, recollecting the parting words of their guest for the first time. "Harper!" echoed Dunwoodie, turning towards her with the swiftness of lightning. "What of him? Do you know him?" "It is in vain," said Henry, drawing him aside. "Frances clings to hope with the fondness of a sister. Retire, my love, and leave me with my friend." But Frances read an expression in the eye of Dunwoodie that chained her to the spot. After struggling to command her feelings, she continued, "He stayed with us for 2 days. He was with us when Henry was arrested." And did you know him?" "Nay," continued Frances, catching her breath as she witnessed the intense interest of her lover, "we knew him not. He came to us in the night, a stranger, and remained with us during the severe storm; but he seemed to take an interest in Henry, and promised him his friendship." "What!" exclaimed the youth in astonishment, "did he know your brother?" "Certainly; it was at his request that Henry threw aside his disguise." "But," said Dunwoodie, turning pale with suspense, "he knew him not as an officer of the royal army?" "Indeed he did," cried Miss Peyton, "and he cautioned us against this very danger." Dunwoodie caught up the fatal paper, that still lay where it had fallen from his own hands, and studied its characters intently. Something seemed to bewilder his brain. He passed his hand over his forehead, while each eye was fixed on him in dreadful suspense, all feeling afraid to admit those hopes anew that had been so sadly destroyed. "What said he? What promised he?" at length Dunwoodie asked, with feverish impatience. "He bid Henry apply to him when in danger, and promised to requite the son for the hospitality of the father." "Said he this, knowing him to be a British officer?" "Most certainly, and with a view to this very danger." "Then," cried the youth aloud, and yielding to his rapture, "then you are safe; then I will save him. Yes, Harper will never forget his word." "But has he the power to?" said Frances. "Can he move the stubborn purpose of Washington?" "Can he? If he cannot," shouted the youth, "if he cannot, who can? Green and Heath and young Hamilton are nothing compared to this Harper. But," rushing to his mistress, and pressing her hands convulsively, "repeat to me, you say you have his promise?" Surely, surely, Peyton, his solemn, deliberate promise, knowing all the circumstances—" "Rest easy," cried Dunwoodie, holding her to his bosom for a moment. "Rest easy, for Henry is safe." He waited not to explain, but darting from the room, he left the family in amazement. They continued in silent wonder until they heard the feet of his charger, as he dashed from the door with the speed of an arrow. A long time was spent after this abrupt departure of the youth, by the anxious friends he had left, in discussing the probability of his success. The confidence of his manner had, however, communicated to his auditors something of his own spirit. Each felt that the prospects of Henry were again brightening, and with their reviving hopes they experienced a renewal of spirits, which, in all but Henry himself, amounted to pleasure. With him, indeed, his state was too awful to admit of trifling, and for a few hours he was condemned to feel how much more intolerable was suspense than even the certainty of calamity. Not so with Frances. She, with all the reliance of affection, reposed in security on the assurance of Dunwoodie, without harassing herself with doubts that she possessed not the means of satisfying. But believing her lover able to accomplish everything that a man could do, and retaining a vivid recollection of the manner and benevolent appearance of Harper, she abandoned herself to all the felicity of renovated hope. The joy of Miss Peyton was more sobered, and she took frequent occasions to reprove her niece for the exuberance of her spirits, before there was a certainty that their expectations were to be realized. But the slight smile that hovered around the lips of the virgin contradicted the very sobriety of feeling that she inculcated. "Why, dearest aunt," said Frances playfully, in reply to one of her frequent reprimands, "would you have me repress the pleasure that I feel at Henry's deliverance, when you yourself have so often declared it to be impossible that such men as ruled in our country could sacrifice an innocent man?" "Nay, I did believe it impossible, my child, and yet think so; but still there is a discretion to be shown in joy as well as in sorrow." Frances recollected the declaration of Isabella, and turned an eye filled with tears of gratitude on her excellent aunt, as she replied, "True, but there are feelings that will not yield to reason. Ah, here are those monsters who have come to witness the death of a fellow creature, moving around yon field as if life was to them nothing but a military show." "It is but little more to the hireling soldier," said Henry, endeavoring to forget his uneasiness. "You gaze, my love, as if you thought a military show of some importance," said Miss Peyton, observing her niece to be looking from the window with a fixed and abstracted attention. But Frances answered not. From the window where she stood, the path that they had traveled through the highlands was easily to be seen, and the mountain which held on its summit the mysterious hut was directly before her. Its side was rugged and barren, huge and apparently impassive barriers of rocks presenting themselves through the stunted oaks, which, stripped of their foliage, were scattered over its surface. The base of the hill was not half a mile from the house, and the object which attracted the notice of Frances was the figure of a man, emerging from behind a rock of remarkable formation, and as suddenly disappearing. The maneuver was several times repeated, as if it were the intention of the fugitive, for such by his air he seemed to be, to reconnoiter the proceedings of the soldiery, and assure himself of the position of things on the plain. Notwithstanding the distance, Frances instantly imbibed the opinion that it was Birch. Perhaps this impression was partly owing to the air and figure of the man, but in a great measure to the idea that presented itself in formerly beholding the object at the summit of the mountain. That they were the same figure she was confident, although this wanted the appearance which in the other she had taken for the pack of the peddler. Harvey had so connected himself with the mysterious deportment of Harper within her imagination, that under circumstances of less agitation than those in which she had labored since her arrival, she would have kept her suspicions to herself. Frances therefore sat ruminating on this second appearance in silence, and endeavoring to trace what possible connection this extraordinary man could have with the fortunes of her own family. He had certainly saved Sarah in some degree from the blow that had partially alighted on her, and in no instance had he proved himself to be hostile to their interests. After gazing for a long time at the point where she had last seen the figure, in the vain expectation of its reappearance, she returned to her friends in the apartment. Miss Peyton was sitting by Sarah, who gave some slight additional signs of observing what passed, but who still continued insensible either to joy or grief. "I suppose by this time, my love, that you are well acquainted with the maneuvers of a regiment," said Miss Peyton. "It is not a bad quality in a soldier's wife, at all events." "I am not a wife yet," said Frances, coloring to the eyes, "and we have little reason to wish for another wedding in our family." "Frances!" exclaimed her brother, starting from his seat, and pacing the floor in violent agitation, "touch not the cord again, I entreat you. While my fate is uncertain, I would wish to be at peace with all men." "Then let the uncertainty cease," cried Frances, springing to the door, "for here comes Peyton with the joyful intelligence of your release." The words were hardly uttered before the door opened, and the major entered. In his air there was the appearance of neither success nor defeat, but there was a marked display of vexation. He took the hand that Frances, in the fullness of her heart, extended towards him, but instantly relinquishing it, threw himself into a chair, in evident fatigue. "You have failed," said Wharton, with a bound of his heart, but an appearance of composure. "Have you seen Harper?" cried Frances, turning pale. "I have not. I crossed the river in one boat, as he must have been coming to this side in another. I returned without delay, and traced him for several miles into the Highlands, by the western pass, but there I unaccountably lost him. I have returned here to relieve your uneasiness, but see him I will this night, and bring a respite for Henry." "But saw you Washington?" asked Miss Peyton. Dunwoodie gazed at her a moment in abstracted musing, and the question was repeated. He answered gravely, and with some reserve, "The commander-in-chief had left his quarters." "But Peyton," cried Frances, in returning terror, "if they should not see each other, it will be too late. Harper alone will not be sufficient." Her lover turned his eyes slowly on her anxious countenance, and dwelling a moment on her features, said, still musing, "You say that he promised to assist Henry?" "Certainly, of his own accord, and in requital for the hospitality he had received." Dunwoodie shook his head, and began to look grave. "I like not that word hospitality; it has an empty sound. There must be something more reasonable to tie Harper. I dread some mistake. Repeat to me all that passed." Frances, in a hurried and earnest voice, complied with his request. She related particularly the manner of his arrival at the Locusts, the reception that he received, and the events that passed as minutely as her memory could supply her with the means. As she alluded to the conversation that occurred between her father and his guest, the major smiled, but remained silent. She then gave a detail of Henry's arrival, and the events of the following day. She dwelt upon the part where Harper had desired her brother to throw aside his disguise, and recounted, with wonderful accuracy, his remarks upon the hazard of the step that the youth had taken. She even remembered a remarkable expression of his to her brother, "that he was safer from Harper's knowledge of his person than he would be without it." Frances mentioned, with the warmth of youthful admiration, the benevolent character of his deportment to herself, and gave a minute relation of his adieus to the whole family. Dunwoodie at first listened with grave attention. Evident satisfaction followed as she proceeded. When she spoke of herself in connection with their guest, he smiled with pleasure, and as she concluded, he exclaimed, with delight, "We are safe! we are safe!" But he was interrupted, as will be seen in the following chapter. End of chapter 27. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by A.R. Dobbs, San Francisco. The Spy, by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 28. The owlet loves the gloom of night, the lark salutes the day, the timid dove will coo at hand, but falcons soar away. Song in duo. In a country settled like these states, by people who fled their native land and much-loved firesides, victims of consciences and religious zeal, none of the decencies and solemnities of a Christian death are dispensed with, when circumstances will admit of their exercise. The good woman of the house was a strict adherent to the forms of the church to which she belonged, and having herself been awakened to a sense of her depravity by the ministry of the divine who harangued the people of the adjoining parish, she thought it was from his exhortations only that salvation could be meted out to the short-lived hopes of Henry Wharton. Not that the kind-hearted matron was so ignorant of the doctrines of the religion which she professed as to depend theoretically on mortal aid for protection, but she had, to use her own phrase, "sat so long under the preaching of good Mr. Blank," that she had unconsciously imbibed a practical reliance on his assistance, for that which her faith should have taught her could come from the Deity alone. With her the consideration of death was at all times awful, and the instant that the sentence of the prisoner was promulgated, she dispatched Caesar, mounted on one of her husband's best horses, in quest of her clerical monitor. This step had been taken without consulting either Henry or his friends, and it was only when the services of Caesar were required on some domestic emergency that she explained the nature of his absence. The youth heard her, at first, with an unconquerable reluctance to admit of such a spiritual guide; but as our view of the things of this life becomes less vivid, our prejudices and habits cease to retain their influence, and a civil bow of thanks was finally given in requital for the considerate care of the well-meaning woman. The black returned early from his expedition, and, as well as could be gathered from his somewhat incoherent narrative, a minister of God might be expected to arrive in the course of the day. The interruption that we mentioned in our preceding chapter was occasioned by the entrance of the landlady. At the intercession of Dunwoodie, orders had been given to the sentinel who guarded the door of Henry's room, that the members of the prisoner's family should, at all times, have free access to his apartment. Caesar was included in this arrangement, as a matter of convenience, by the officer in command, but strict inquiry and examination was made into the errand of every other applicant for admission. The major had, however, included himself among the relatives of the British officer, and one pledge, that no rescue should be attempted, was given in his name for them all. A short conversation was passing between the woman of the house and the corporal of the guard, before the door that the sentinel had already opened in anticipation of the decision of his non-commissioned commandant. "Would you refuse the consolations of religion to a fellow creature about to suffer death?" said the matron, with earnest zeal. "Would you plunge a soul into the fiery furnace, and a minister at hand to point out the straight and narrow path?" "I'll tell you what, good woman," returned the corporal, gently pushing her away, "I've no notion of my back being a highway for any man to walk to heaven upon. A pretty figure I should make at the pickets, for disobeying orders. Just step down and ask Lieutenant Mason, and you may bring in a whole congregation. We have not taken the guard from the foot soldiers but an hour, and I shouldn't like to have it said that we know less than the militia." "Admit the woman," said Dunwoodie, sternly, observing for the first time that one of his own corps was on post. The corporal raised his hand to his cap, and fell back in silence. The soldier stood to his arms, and the matron entered. "Here is a reverend gentleman below, come to soothe the parting soul, in the place of our own divine, who is engaged with an appointment that could not be put aside. 'Tis to bury old Mr. Blank." "Show him in at once," said Henry, with feverish impatience. "But will the sentinel let him pass? I would not wish a friend of Mr. Blank to be rudely stopped on the threshold, and he a stranger." All eyes were now turned on Dunwoodie, who, looking at his watch, spoke a few words with Henry in an undertone, and hastened from the apartment, followed by Frances. The subject of their conversation was a wish expressed by the prisoner for a clergyman of his own persuasion, and a promise from the major that one should be sent from Fishkill town, through which he was about to pass, on his way to the ferry, to intercept the expected return of Harper. Mason soon made his bow at the door, and willingly complied with the wishes of the landlady, and the divine was invited to make his appearance accordingly. The person who was ushered into the apartment, preceded by Caesar, and followed by the matron, was a man beyond the middle age, who might rather be said to approach the downhill of life. In stature he was above the size of ordinary men, though his excessive leanness might contribute in deceiving as to his height. His countenance was sharp and unbending, and every muscle seemed set in rigid compression. No joy or relaxation appeared ever to have dwelt on features that frowned habitually, as if in detestation of the vices of mankind. The brows were beetling, dark, and forbidding, giving the promise of eyes of no less repelling expression, but the organs were concealed beneath a pair of enormous green goggles, through which they glared around with the fierceness that denounced the coming day of wrath. All was fanaticism, uncharitableness, and denunciation. Long, lank hair, a mixture of gray and black, fell down his neck, and in some degree obscured the sides of his face, and, parting on his forehead, fell in either direction in straight and formal screens. On the top of this ungraceful exhibition was laid impending forward, so as to overhang in some measure the whole fabric, a large hat of 3 equal cocks. His coat was of a rusty black, and his breeches and stockings were of the same color, his shoes without luster, and half concealed beneath huge plated buckles. He stalked into the room, and giving a stiff nod with his head, took the chair offered him by the back in dignified silence. For several minutes no one broke this ominous pause in the conversation. Henry, feeling a repugnance to his guest that he was vainly endeavoring to conquer, and the stranger himself drawing forth occasional sighs and groans that threatened a dissolution of the unequal connection between his sublimated soul and its ungainly tenement. During this death-like penetration, Mr. Wharton, with a feeling nearly allied to that of his son, led Sarah from the apartment. His retreat was noticed by the divine in a kind of scornful disdain, who began to hum the air of a popular psalm tune, giving it the full richness of the twang that distinguishes the Eastern psalmody. Footnote: by Eastern is meant the states of New England, which, being originally settled by Puritans, still retain many distinct shades of character. End of footnote. "Caesar," said Miss Peyton, "hand the gentleman some refreshment. He must need it after his ride." "My strength is not in the things of this life," said the divine, speaking in a hollow, sepulchral voice. "Thrice have I this day held forth in my master's service, and fainted not. Still, 'tis prudent to help this frail tenement of clay, for surely the laborer is worthy of his hire." Opening a pair of enormous jaws, he took a good measure of the proffered brandy, and suffered it to glide downwards with that sort of facility with which man is prone to sin. "I apprehend, then, sir, that fatigue will disable you from performing the duties which kindness has inclined you to attempt."
"Woman," exclaimed the stranger with energy, "when was I ever known to shrink from a duty? But judge not lest ye be judged, and fancy not that it is given to mortal eyes to fathom the intentions of the Deity."
"Nay," returned the maiden, meekly, and slightly disgusted with his jargon, "I pretend not to judge of either events, or the intentions of my fellow creatures, much less those of Omnipotence."
"'Tis well, woman, 'tis well," cried the minister, moving his head with supercilious disdain. "Humility becometh thy sex and lost condition. Thy weakness driveth thee on headlong like unto the bosom of destruction."
Surprised at this extraordinary deportment, but yielding to that habit which urges us to speak reverently on sacred subjects, even when perhaps we had better continue silent, Miss Peyton replied, "There is a power above that can and will sustain us all in well-doing, if we seek its support in humility and truth." The stranger turned a lowering look at the speaker, and then, composing himself into an air of self-abasement, he continued in the same repelling tones,
"It is not every one that crieth out for mercy that will be heard. The ways of Providence are not to be judged by men. Many are called, but few chosen. It is easier to talk of humility than to feel it. Are you so humble, vile worm, as to wish to glorify God by your own damnation? If not, away with you for a publican and a Pharisee."
Such gross fanaticism was uncommon in America, and Miss Peyton began to imbibe the impression that her guest was deranged; but remembering that he had been sent by a well-known divine, and one of reputation, she discarded the idea, and with some forbearance observed, "I may deceive myself in believing that mercy is proffered to all, but it is so soothing a doctrine that I would not willingly be undeceived."
"Mercy is only for the elect," cried the stranger with an unaccountable energy, "and you are in the valley of the shadow of death. Are you not a follower of idle ceremonies, which belong to the vain church that our tyrants would gladly establish here, along with their stamp acts and tea laws? Answer me that, woman, and remember that heaven hears your answer. Are you not of that idolatrous communion?"
"I worship at the altars of my fathers," said Miss Peyton, motioning to Henry for silence, "but bow to no other idol than my own infirmities."
"Yes, yes, I know ye, self-righteous and papal as ye are, followers of forms, and listeners to bookish preaching. Think you, woman, that holy Paul had notes in his hand to propound the word to the believers?"
"My presence disturbs you," said Miss Peyton, rising. "I will leave you with my nephew, and offer those prayers in private that I did wish to mingle with his." So saying, she withdrew, followed by the landlady, who was not a little shocked, and somewhat surprised, by the intemperate zeal of her new acquaintance; for, although the good woman believed that Miss Peyton and her whole church were on the high road to destruction, she was by no means accustomed to hear such offensive and open avowals of their fate. Henry had with difficulty repressed the indignation excited by this unprovoked attack on his meek and unresisting aunt, but as the door closed on her retiring figure, he gave way to his feelings. "I must confess, sir," he exclaimed with heat, "that in receiving a minister of God, I thought I was admitting a Christian, and one who, by feeling his own weaknesses, knew how to pity the frailties of others. You have wounded the meek spirit of an excellent woman, and I acknowledge but little inclination to mingle in prayer with so intolerant a spirit." The minister stood erect, with grave composure, following with his eyes, in a kind of scornful pity, the retiring females, and suffered the expostulation of the youth to be given, as if unworthy of his notice. A third voice, however, spoke. "Such a denunciation would have driven many women into fits, but it has answered the purpose well enough, as it is." "Who's that?" cried the prisoner, in amazement, gazing around the room in quest of the speaker. "It is I, Captain Wharton," said Harvey Birch, removing the spectacles, and exhibiting his piercing eyes, shining under a pair of false eyebrows. "Good heavens! Harvey!" "Silence!" said the peddler, solemnly. "'Tis a name not to be mentioned, and least of all here, within the heart of the American army." Birch paused and gazed around him for a moment, with an emotion exceeding the base passion of fear, and then continued in a gloomy tone, "There are 1,000 halters in that very name, and little hope would there be left me of another escape, should I be again taken. This is a fearful venture that I am making, but I could not sleep in quiet, and know that an innocent man was about to die the death of a dog, when I might save him." "No," said Henry, with a glow of generous feeling on his cheek, "if the risk to you be so heavy, retire as you came, and leave me to my fate. Dunwoodie is making, even now, powerful exertions on my behalf, and if he meets with Mr. Harper in the course of the night, my liberation is certain." "Harper!" echoed the peddler, remaining with his hands raised, in the act of replacing the spectacles. "What do you know of Harper, and why do you think he will do you a service?" "I have his promise. You remember our recent meeting in my father's dwelling, and he then gave me an unasked promise to assist me." "Yes, but do you know him? That is, why do you think he has the power, or what reason have you for believing he will remember his word?" "If there ever was the stamp of truth, or simple honest benevolence, in the countenance of man, it shone in his," said Henry. "Besides, Dunwoodie has powerful friends in the rebel army, and it would be better that I take the chance where I am, than thus to expose you to certain death if detected." "Captain Wharton," said Birch, looking guardedly around, and speaking with impressive seriousness of manner, "if I fail you, all fail you. No Harper nor Dunwoodie can save your life. Unless you get out with me, and that within the hour, you die tomorrow on the gallows of a murderer. Yes, such are their laws. The man who fights, and kills, and plunders, is honored; but he who serves his country as a spy, no matter how faithfully, no matter how honestly, lives to be reviled, or dies like the vilest criminal." "You forget, Mr. Birch," said the youth, a little indignantly, "that I am not a treacherous, lurking spy, who deceives to betray, but innocent of the charge imputed to me." The blood rushed over the pale, meager features of the peddler, until his face was one glow of fire, but it passed quickly away as he replied, "I have told you truth. Caesar met me as he was going on his errand this morning, and with him I have laid the plan which, if executed as I wish, will save you; otherwise you are lost. And I again tell you that no other power on earth, not even Washington, can save you." "I submit," said the prisoner, yielding to his earnest manner, and goaded by the fears which were thus awakened anew. The peddler beckoned him to be silent, and walking to the door, opened it with the stiff, formal air with which he had entered the apartment. "Friend, let no one enter," he said to the sentinel. "We are about to go to prayer, and would wish to be alone." "I don't know that any will wish to interrupt you," returned the soldier, with a waggish leer of his eye; "but should they be so disposed, I have no power to stop them, if they be of the prisoner's friends. I have my orders, and must mind them, whether the Englishman goes to heaven or not." "Audacious sinner!" said the pretended priest, "have you not the fear of God before your eyes? I tell you, as you will dread punishment at the last day, to let none of the idolatrous communion enter, to mingle in the prayers of the righteous." "Whew! What a noble commander you'd make for Sergeant Hollister! You'd preach him dumb in a roll call. Harkee, I'll thank you not to make such a noise when you hold forth, as to drown our bugles, or you may get a poor fellow a short horn at his grog, for not turning out to the evening parade. If you want to be alone, have you no knife to stick over the door latch, that you must have a troop of horse to guard your meeting house?" The peddler took the hint, and closed the door immediately, using the precaution suggested by the dragoon. "You overact your part," said young Wharton, in constant apprehension of discovery. "Your zeal is too impertinent." "For a foot soldier, and them eastern militia, it might be," said Harvey, turning a bag upside down that Caesar now handed him; "but these dragoons are fellows that you must brag down. A faint heart, Captain Wharton, would do but little here. But come, here is a black shroud for your good-looking countenance," taking at the same time a parchment mask, and fitting it to the face of Henry. "The master and the man must change places for a season." "I don't think he looks a bit like me," said Caesar, with disgust, as he surveyed his young master with his new complexion. "Stop a minute, Caesar," said the peddler, with a lurking drollery that at times formed part of his manner, "till we get on the wool." "He worse than ebber now," cried the discontented African. "I t'ink colored man like a sheep. I never see such a lip, Harvey. He most as big as a sausage." Great pains had been taken in forming the different articles used in the disguise of Captain Wharton, and when arranged under the skillful superintendence of the peddler, they formed together a transformation that would easily escape detection from any but an extraordinary observer. The mask was stuffed and shaped in such a manner as to preserve the peculiarities as well as the color of the African visage, and the wig was so artfully formed of black and white wool as to imitate the pepper and salt color of Caesar's own head, and to exact plaudits from the black himself, who thought it an excellent counterfeit in everything but quality. "There is but one man in the American army who could detect you, Captain Wharton," said the peddler, surveying his work with satisfaction, "and he is just now out of our way." "And who is he?" "The man who made you prisoner. He would see your white skin through a plank. But strip, both of you; your clothes must be exchanged from head to foot." Caesar, who had received minute instructions from the peddler in their morning interview, immediately commenced throwing aside his coarse garments, which the youth took up and prepared to invest himself with, unable, however, to repress a few signs of loathing. In the manner of the peddler there was an odd mixture of care and humor. The former was the result of a perfect knowledge of their danger, and the means necessary to be used in avoiding it; and the latter proceeded from the unavoidably ludicrous circumstances before him, acting on an indifference which sprang from habit and long familiarity with such scenes as the present. "Here, captain," he said, taking up some loose wool, and beginning to stuff the stockings of Caesar, which were already on the leg of the prisoner. "Some judgment is necessary in shaping this limb. You will have to display it on horseback, and the southern dragoons are so used to the brittle shins, that should they notice your well-turned calf, they'd know at once it never belonged to a black." "Golly!" said Caesar, with a chuckle that exhibited a mouth open from ear to ear, "Massa Harry breeches fit." "Anything but your leg," said the peddler, coolly pursuing the toilet of Henry. "Slip on the coat, captain, over all. Upon my word, you'd pass well at a pinkster frolic. And here, Caesar, place this powdered wig over your curls, and be careful and look out of the window whenever the door is open, and on no account speak, or you will betray all." "S'pose Harvey think a colored man ain't got a tongue like other folk," grumbled the black, as he took the station assigned to him. Everything now was arranged for action, and the peddler very deliberately went over the whole of his injunctions to the two actors in the scene. The captain he conjured to dispense with his erect military carriage, and for a season to adopt the humble paces of his father's negro; and Caesar he enjoined to silence and disguise, so long as he could possibly maintain them. Thus prepared, he opened the door, and called aloud to the sentinel, who had retired to the farthest end of the passage in order to avoid receiving any of that spiritual comfort which he felt was the sole property of another. "Let the woman of the house be called," said Harvey, in the solemn key of his assumed character, "and let her come alone. The prisoner is in a happy train of meditation, and must not be led from his devotions." Caesar sank his face between his hands, and when the soldier looked into the apartment, he thought he saw his charge in deep abstraction. Casting a glance of huge contempt at the divine, he called aloud for the good woman of the house. She hastened at the summons, in earnest zeal, entertaining a secret hope that she was to be admitted to the gossip of a deathbed repentance. "Sister," said the minister, in the authoritative tones of a master, "have you in the house the Christian criminal's last moments, or thoughts on eternity for them who die a violent death?" "I never heard of the book," said the matron in astonishment. "'Tis not unlikely there are many books you have never heard of. It is impossible for this poor penitent to pass in peace without the consolations of that volume. 1 hour's reading in it is worth an age of man's preaching." "Bless me, what a treasure to possess! When was it put out?" "It was first put out at Geneva in the Greek language, and then translated at Boston. It is a book, woman, that should be in the hands of every Christian, especially such as die upon the gallows. Have a horse prepared instantly for this black, who shall accompany me to my brother, and I will send down the volume yet in season. Brother, compose thy mind. You are now in the narrow path to glory." Caesar wriggled a little in his chair, but he had sufficient recollection to conceal his face with hands that were, in their turn, concealed by gloves. The landlady departed to comply with this very reasonable request, and the group of conspirators were again left to themselves. "This is well," said the peddler, "but the difficult task is to deceive the officer who commands the guard. He is lieutenant to Lawton, and has learned some of the captain's own cunning in these things. Remember, Captain Wharton," continued he, with an air of pride, "that now is the moment when everything depends on our coolness." "My fate can be made but little worse than it is at present, my worthy fellow," said Henry; "but for your sake I will do all that in me lies." "And wherein can I be more forlorn and persecuted than I am now?" asked the peddler, with that wild incoherence which often crossed his manner.
but I have promised one to save you, and to him I have never yet broken my word." "And who is he?" said Henry, with awakened interest. "No one." The man soon returned, and announced that the horses were at the door. Harvey gave the captain a glance, and led the way down the stairs, first desiring the woman to leave the prisoner to himself, in order that he might digest the wholesome mental food that he had so lately received. A rumor of the odd character of the priest had spread from the sentinel at the door to his comrades, so that when Harvey and Wharton reached the open space before the building, they found a dozen idle dragoons loitering about with the waggish intention of quizzing the fanatic, and employed in affected admiration of the steeds. "A fine horse," said the leader in this plan of mischief, "but a little low in flesh, I suppose from hard labor in your calling." "My calling may be laborsome to both myself and this faithful beast, but then a day of settling is at hand that will reward me for all my outgoings and incomings," said Birch, putting his foot in the stirrup and preparing to mount. "You work for pay, then, as we fight for it," cried another of the party. "Even so. Is not the laborer worthy of his hire?" "Come, suppose you give us a little preaching. We have a leisure moment just now, and there's no telling how much good you might do a set of reprobates like us in a few words. Here, mount this horse block, and take your text where you please." The men now gathered in eager delight around the peddler, who, glancing his eye expressively towards the captain, who had been suffered to mount, replied, "Doubtless, for such is my duty. But, Caesar, you can ride up the road and deliver the note. The unhappy prisoner will be wanting the book, for his hours are numbered." "Aye, aye, go along, Caesar, and get the book," shouted half a dozen voices, all crowding eagerly around the ideal priest, in anticipation of a frolic. The peddler inwardly dreaded that, in their unceremonious handling of himself and garments, his hat and wig might be displaced, when detection would be certain. He was therefore fain to comply with their request. Ascending the horseback, after hemming once or twice, and casting several glances at the captain, who continued immovable, he commenced as follows: "I shall call your attention, my brethren, to that portion of scripture which you will find in the second book of Samuel, and which is written in the following words: 'And the king lamented over Abner, and said, Died Abner as a fool dieth? Thy hands were not bound, nor thy feet put into fetters. As a man falleth before wicked men, so fellest thou. And all the people wept again over him.' Caesar, ride forward, I say, and obtain the book as directed. Thy master is groaning in spirit even now for the want of it." "An excellent text!" cried the dragoons. "Go on, go on! Let the snowball stay. He wants to be edified as well as another." "What are you at there, scoundrels?" cried Lieutenant Mason, as he came in sight from a walk he had taken to sneer at the evening parade of the regiment of militia. "Away with every man of you to your quarters, and let me find that each horse is cleaned and littered when I come round." The sound of the officer's voice operated like a charm, and no priest could desire a more silent congregation, although he might possibly have wished for one that was more numerous. Mason had not done speaking when it was reduced to the image of Caesar only. The peddler took that opportunity to mount, but he had to preserve the gravity of his movements, for the remark of the troopers upon the condition of their beasts was but too just, and a dozen dragoon horses stood saddled and bridled at hand, ready to receive their riders at a moment's warning. "Well, have you bitted the poor fellow within," said Mason, "that he can take his last ride under the curb of divinity, old gentleman?" "There is evil in thy conversation, profane man," cried the priest, raising his hands and casting his eyes upwards in holy horror. "So I will depart from thee unhurt, as Daniel was liberated from the lion's den." "Off with you for a hypocritical, psalm-singing, canting rogue in disguise," said Mason scornfully. "By the life of Washington, it worries an honest fellow to see such voracious beasts of prey ravaging a country for which he sheds his blood. If I had you on a Virginia plantation for a quarter of an hour, I'd teach you to worm the tobacco with the turkeys." "I leave you and shake the dust off my shoes, that no remnant of this wicked hole may tarnish the vestments of the godly." "Start, or I will shake the dust from your jacket, designing knave. A fellow to be preaching to my men! There's Hollister's put the devil in them by his exhorting. The rascals were getting too conscientious to strike a blow that would raise the skin. But hold! Whither do you travel, Master Blackie, in such godly company?" "He goes," said the minister, hastily speaking for his companion, "to return with a book of much condolence and virtue to the sinful youth above, whose soul will speedily become white, even as his outwards are black and unseemly. Would you deprive a dying man of the consolation of religion?" "No, no, poor fellow, his fate is bad enough. A famous good breakfast his prim body of an aunt gave us. But hark ye, Mr. Revelation, if the youth must die, secundum arlem, let it be under a gentleman's direction, and my advice is, that you never trust that skeleton of yours among us again, or I will take the skin off and leave you naked." "Out upon thee for a reviler and scoffer of goodness!" said Birch, moving slowly and with due observance of clerical dignity down the road, followed by the imaginary Caesar. "But I leave thee and that behind me that will prove thy condemnation, and take from thee a hearty and joyful deliverance." "Damn him," muttered the trooper; "the fellow rides like a stake, and his legs stick out like the cocks of his hat. I wish I had him below these hills, where the law is not over particular. I'd—" "Corporal of the guard! Corporal of the guard!" shouted the sentinel in the passage to the chambers. "Corporal of the guard! Corporal of the guard!" The subaltern flew up the narrow stairway that led to the room of the prisoner, and demanded the meaning of the outcry. The soldier was standing at the open door of the apartment, looking in with a suspicious eye on the supposed British officer. On observing his lieutenant, he fell back with habitual respect, and replied with an air of puzzled thought,— "I don't know, sir, but just now the prisoner looked queer. Ever since the preacher has left him, he don't look as he used to do. But," gazing intently over the shoulder of his officer, "it must be him, too. There is the same powdered head, and the darn in the coat, where he was hit the day we had the last brush with the enemy. And then all this noise is occasioned by your doubting whether that poor gentleman is your prisoner or not, is it, sirrah? Who the devil do you think it can be else?" "I don't know who else it can be," returned the fellow sullenly; "but he has grown thicker and shorter, if it is he; and see for yourself, sir, he shakes all over, like a man in an ague." This was but too true. Caesar was an alarmed auditor of this short conversation, and, from congratulating himself upon the dexterous escape of his young master, his thoughts were very naturally beginning to dwell upon the probable consequences to his own person. The pause that succeeded the last remark of the sentinel in no degree contributed to the restoration of his faculties. Lieutenant Mason was busied in examining with his own eyes the suspected person of the black, and Caesar was aware of the fact by stealing a look through a passage under one of his arms, that he had left expressly for the purpose of reconnoitering. Captain Lawton would have discovered the fraud immediately, but Mason was by no means so quick-sighted as his commander. He therefore turned rather contemptuously to the soldier, and speaking in an undertone, observed,— "That Anabaptist, Methodistical, Quaker, psalm-singing rascal has frightened the boy with his farrago about flames and brimstone. I'll step in and cheer him with a little rational conversation." "I have heard of fear making a man white," said the soldier, drawing back and staring as if his eyes would start from their sockets, "but it has changed the royal captain to a black." The truth was that Caesar, unable to hear what Mason uttered in a low voice, and having every fear aroused in him by what had already passed, incautiously removed the wig a little from one of his ears, in order to hear the better, without in the least remembering that its color might prove fatal to his disguise. The sentinel had kept his eyes fastened on the prisoner, and noticed the action. The attention of Mason was instantly drawn to the same object, and forgetting all delicacy for a brother of officer in distress,
or, in short, forgetting everything but the censure that might alight on his corps, the lieutenant sprang forward and seized the terrified African by the throat; for no sooner had Caesar heard his color named than he knew his discovery was certain, and at the first sound of Mason's heavy boot on the floor, he arose from his seat and retreated precipitately to a corner of the room. "Who are you?" cried Mason, dashing the head of the old man against the angle of the wall at each interrogatory. "Who the devil are you? And where is the Englishman? Speak, thou thundercloud! Answer me, you jackdaw, or I'll hang you on the gallows of the spy." Caesar continued firm; neither the threats nor the blows could extract any reply, until the lieutenant, by a very natural transition in the attack, sent his heavy boot forward in a direction that brought it in direct contact with the most sensitive part of the negro, his shin. The most obdurate heart could not have exacted further patience, and Caesar instantly gave in. The first words he spoke were, "Golly, massa, you tink I got no feeling?" "By heavens!" shouted the lieutenant, "it is the negro himself! Scoundrel, where is your master, and who was the priest?" While speaking he made a movement as if about to renew the attack, but Caesar cried aloud for mercy, promising to tell all that he knew. "Who was the priest?" replied the dragoon, drawing back his formidable leg, and holding it in threatening suspense. "Harvey! Harvey!" cried Caesar, dancing from one leg to the other, as he thought each member in turn might be assailed. "Harvey who, you black villain?" cried the impatient lieutenant, as he executed a full measure of vengeance by letting his leg fly. "Birch!" shrieked Caesar, falling on his knees, the tears rolling in large drops over his shining face. "Harvey Birch!" echoed the trooper, hurling the black from him, and rushing from the room. "To arms! To arms! 50 guineas for the life of the peddler, spy! Give no quarter to either! Mount! Mount! To arms! To horse!" During the uproar occasioned by the assembling of the dragoons, who all rushed tumultuously to their horses, Caesar rose from the floor, where he had been thrown by Mason, and began to examine into his injuries. Happily for himself, he had alighted on his head, and consequently sustained no material damage. Chapter 28.
Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Today's recording by Chris V. The Spy, A Tale of the Neutral Ground, by James Fenimore Cooper, edited by Nathaniel Waring Barnes. Chapter 29. Away went Gillipan, neck or nought. Away went hat and wig. He little dreamt, when he set out, of running such a rig. The road which it was necessary for the peddler and the English captain to travel, in order to reach the shelter of the hills, lay for a half-mile in full view from the door of the building that had so recently been the prison of the latter, running for the whole distance over the rich plain that spreads to the very foot of the mountains, which here rise in a nearly perpendicular ascent from their bases. It then turned short to the right, and was obliged to follow the windings of nature, as it won its way into the bosom of the highlands. To preserve the supposed difference in their stations, Harvey rode a short distance ahead of his companion, and maintained the sober, dignified pace that was suited to his assumed character. On their right, the regiment of foot that we have already mentioned lay in tents, and the sentinels who guarded their encampment were to be seen moving with measured tread under the hills themselves. The first impulse of Henry was, certainly, to urge the beast he rode to his greatest speed at once, and by a coup de main not only accomplish his escape, but relieve himself from the torturing suspense of his situation. But the forward movement that the youth made for this purpose was instantly checked by the peddler. "Hold up!" he cried. dexterously reining his own horse across the path of the other. "Would you ruin us both? Fall into the place of a black following his master. Did you not see their blooded chargers, all saddled and bridled, standing in the sun before the house? How long do you think that miserable Dutch horse you are on would hold his speed, if pursued by the Virginians? Every foot that we gain without giving the alarm counts a day in our lives. Ride steadily after me, and on no account look back. They are as subtle as foxes, and as ravenous for blood as wolves." Henry reluctantly restrained his impatience, and followed the direction of the peddler. His imagination, however, continually alarmed him with the fancied sounds of pursuit, though Birch, who occasionally looked back under the pretense of addressing his companion, assured him that all continued quiet and peaceful. "But," said Henry, "it will not be possible for Caesar to remain long undiscovered. Had he not better put our horses to the gallop, and by the time they can reflect on the cause of our flight, we can reach the corner of the woods?" "Ah, you know little of them, Captain Wharton," returned the peddler. "There is a sergeant at this moment looking after us, as if he thought all was not right. The keen-eyed fellow watches me like a tiger lying in wait for his leap. When I stood on the horse-block he half suspected that something was wrong. Nay, check your beast. We must let the animals walk a little, for he is laying his hand on the pommel of his saddle. If he mounts, we are gone. The foot soldiers could reach us with their muskets." "What does he now?" asked Henry, reining his horse to a walk, but at the same time pressing his heels to the animal's sides, to be in readiness for a spring. "He turns from his charger and looks the other way. Now trot on a little ahead of us. He eyes us keenly." "Never mind the footman," said Henry impatiently. "He can do nothing but shoot us, whereas these dragoons may make me a captive again. Surely, Harvey, there are horse moving down the road behind us. Do you see nothing particular?" "Humph!" ejaculated the peddler. "There is something particular, indeed, to be seen behind the thicket on our left. Turn your head a little, and you may see and profit by it too." Henry eagerly seized this permission to look aside, and the blood curdled to his heart as he observed that they were passing a gallows, which unquestionably had been erected for his own execution. He turned his face from the sight in undisguised horror. "There is a warning to be prudent," said the peddler in the sententious manner that he often adopted. "It is a terrific sight, indeed!" cried Henry, for a moment veiling his eyes with his hand, as if to drive a vision before him. The peddler moved his body partly around, and spoke with energetic but gloomy bitterness. "And yet, Captain Wharton, you see it where the setting sun shines full upon you. The air you breathe is clear and fresh from the hills before you. Every step that you take leaves that hated gallows behind, and every dark hollow and every shapeless rock in the mountains offers you a hiding place from the vengeance of your enemies. But I have seen the gibbet raised, when no place of refuge offered. Twice have I been buried in dungeons, where, fettered and in chains, I have passed nights in torture, looking forward to the morning's dawn that was to light me to a death of infamy. The sweat has started from the limbs and seemed already drained of their moisture, and if I ventured to the hole that admitted air through grates of iron to look out upon the smiles of nature, which God has bestowed for the meanest of his creatures, the gibbet has glared before my eyes like an evil conscience, harrowing the soul of a dying man. 4 times have I been in their power, besides this last, but twice did I think my hour had come. It is hard to die at the best, Captain Wharton, but to spend your last moments alone and unpitied, to know that none near you so much as think of the fate that is to you the closing of all that is earthly, to think that in a few hours you are to be led from the gloom, which as you dwell on what follows becomes dear to you, to the face of day, and there to meet all eyes fixed upon you, as if you were a wild beast, and to lose sight of everything amidst the jeers and scoffs of your fellow creatures. That, Captain Ward, that indeed is to die." Henry listened in amazement as his companion uttered this speech with a vehemence altogether new to him. Both seemed to have forgotten their danger and their disguises. "What? Were you ever so near death as that?" "Have I not been hunted beast of this hills for 3 years past?" resumed Harvey, "and once they even led me to the foot of the gallows itself, and I escaped only by an alarm from the royal troops. Had they been a quarter of an hour later, I must have died. There was I placed in the midst of unfeeling men and gaping women and children, as a monster to be cursed. When I would pray to God, my eyes were insulted with the history of my crimes, and when in all that multitude I looked around for a single face that showed me any pity, I could find none. No, not even one. All cursed me as a wretch who would sell his country for gold. The sun was brighter to my eyes than common, but it was the last time I should see it. The fields were gay and pleasant, and everything seemed as if this world was a kind of heaven. Oh, how sweet life was to me at that moment! 'Twas a dreadful hour, Captain Wharton, and such as you have never known. You have friends to feel for you, but I had none but a father to mourn my loss, when he might hear of it, but there was no pity, no consolation near to soothe my anguish. Everything seemed to have deserted me. I even thought that he had forgotten that I lived." "What? Did you feel that God himself had forgotten you, Harvey?" "God never forsakes his servants," returned Birch with reverence, and exhibiting naturally a devotion that hitherto he had only assumed. "And whom did you mean by he?" The peddler raised himself in his saddle to the stiff and upright posture that was suited to his outward appearance. The look of fire that for a short time glowed on his countenance disappeared in the solemn lines of unbending self-abasement, and speaking as if addressing a negro, he replied, "In heaven there is no distinction of color, my brother. Therefore you have a precious charge within you, that you must hereafter render an account of." Dropping his voice, "This is the last sentinel near the road. Look not back as you value your life." Henry remembered the situation, and instantly assumed the humble demeanor of his adopted character. The unaccountable energy of the peddler's manner was soon forgotten in the sense of his own immediate danger, and with the recollection of his critical situation returned all the uneasiness that he had momentarily forgotten. "What see you, Harvey?" he cried, observing the peddler to gaze towards the building they had left, the ominous interest. "What see you at the house?" "That which bodes no good to us," returned the pretended priest. "Throw aside the mask and wig. You will need all your senses without much delay. Throw them in the road. There are none before us that I dread, but there are those behind us who will give us a fearful race." "Nay, then," cried the captain, casting the implements of his disguise into the highway, "let us improve our time to the utmost. We want a full quarter to the turn. Why not push for it at once?" "Be cool. They are in alarm, but they will not mount without an officer, unless they see us fly. Now he comes. He moves to the stables, trots briskly. A dozen are in their saddles. but the officer stops to tighten his girths. They hope to steal a march upon us. He is mounted. Now ride, Captain Wharton, for your life, and keep at my heels. If you quit me, you will be lost." A second request was unnecessary. The instant that Harvey put his horse to his speed, Captain Wharton was at his heels, urging the miserable animal he rode to the utmost. Birch had selected his own beast, and although vastly inferior to the high-fed and blooded chargers of the dragoons, still it was much superior to the little pony that had been thought good enough to carry Caesar Thompson on an errand. A very few jumps convinced the captain that his companion was fast leaving him, and a fearful glance thrown behind informed the fugitive that his enemies were speedily approaching. With that abandonment that makes misery doubly grievous, when it is to be supported alone, Henry cried aloud to the peddler not to desert him. Harvey instantly drew up and suffered his companion to run alongside of his own horse. The cocked hat and wig of the peddler fell from his head the moment that his steed began to move briskly, and this development of their disguise, as it might be termed, was witnessed by the dragoons, who announced their observation by a boisterous shout that seemed to be uttered in the very ears of the fugitives. So loud was the cry, and so short the distance between them. "Had we better not leave our horses," said Henry, "and make for the hills across the fields on our left? The fence will stop our pursuers." "That way lies the gallows," returned the peddler. "These fellows go 3 feet to our 2, and would mind the fence no more than we do these ruts. But it is a short quarter to the turn, and there are 2 roads behind the wood. They may stand to choose until they can take the track, and we shall gain a little upon them." "But this miserable horse is blown already," cried Henry, urging his beast with the end of his bridle. At the same time Harvey aided his efforts by applying the lash of a heavy riding-whip he carried. "He will never stand it for a half-mile farther." "A quarter will do, a quarter will do," said the peddler. "A single quarter will save us, if you follow my directions." Somewhat cheered by the cool and confident manner of his companion, Henry continued silently urging his horse forward. A few moments brought them to the desired turn. As they doubled round a point of low underbrush, the fugitives caught a glimpse of their pursuers scattered along the highway. Mason and the sergeant, being better mounted than the rest of the party, were much nearer to their heels than even the peddler thought could be possible. At the foot of the hills, and for some distance up the dark valley that wound around the mountains, a thick underwood of saplings had been suffering to shoot up, where the heavier growth was felled for the sake of the fuel. At the sight of this cover, Henry again urged the peddler to dismount, and to plunge into the woods, but his request was promptly refused. The 2 roads before mentioned met at very sharp angles at a short distance from the turn, and both were circuitous, so that but a little of either could be seen at a time. The peddler took the one which led to the left, but held it only a moment, for, on reaching a partial opening in the thicket, he darted across into the right-hand path, and led the way up a steep ascent, which lay directly before them. The maneuver saved them. On reaching the fork, the dragoons followed the track, and passed the spot where the fugitives had crossed to the other road before they missed the marks of the footsteps. Their loud cries were heard by Henry and the peddler, as their wearied and breathless animals toiled up the hill, ordering their comrades to the rear to ride in the right direction. The captain again proposed to leave their horses and dash into the thicket. "Not yet, not yet," said Birch in a low voice. "The road falls from the top of this hill, as steep as it rises. First let us gain the top." While speaking, they reached the desired summit, and both threw themselves from their horses. Henry plunged into the thick underwood, which covered the side of the mountain for some distance above them. Harvey stopped to give each of their beasts a few severe blows of his whip, that drove them headlong down the path on the other side of the eminence, and then followed his example. The peddler entered the thicket with little caution, and avoided as much as possible rustling or breaking the branches in his way. There was but time only to shelter his person from view, when a dragoon led up the ascent, and on reaching the height he cried aloud, "I saw one of their horses turning this hill this minute." "Drive on, spur forward, my lads!" shouted Mason. "Give the Englishman quarter, but cut down the peddler, and make an end of him." Henry felt his companion grip his arm hard, as he listened in a great tremor for this cry, which was followed by the passage of a dozen horsemen, with a vigor and speed that showed too plainly how little security their overtired steeds could have afforded them. "Now," said the peddler, rising from the cover to reconnoiter, and standing for a moment in suspense, "all that we gain is clear gain, for as we go up they go down. Let us be stirring." "But will they not follow us, and surround this mountain?" said Henry, rising and imitating the labored but rapid progression of his companion. "Remember, they have foot as well as horse, and at any rate we shall starve in the hills." "Fear nothing, Captain Wharton," said the peddler with confidence. "This is not the mountain that I would be on, but necessity has made me a dexterous pilot among these hills. I will lead you where no man will dare to follow. See, the sun is already setting behind the tops of the western mountains, and it will be 2 hours to the rising of the moon. Who, think you, will follow us far on a November night amongst these rocks and precipices?" "Listen!" exclaimed Henry. "The dragoons are shouting to each other. They miss us already." "Come to the point of this rock, and you may see them," said Harvey, composedly setting himself down to rest. "Nay, they can see us. Observe, they are pointing up with their fingers. There, one has fired his pistol, but the distance is too great, even for a musket." "They will pursue us!" cried the impatient Henry. "Let us be moving!" "They will not think of such a thing," returned the peddler, picking the checkerberries that grew on the thin soil where he sat, and very deliberately chewing them, leaves and all, to refresh his mouth. "What progress could they make here, in their heavy boots and spurs and long swords? No, no, they may go back and turn out the foot, but the horse pass through these defiles, when they can keep the saddle with fear and trembling. Come, follow me, Captain Wharton. We have a troublesome march before us, but I will bring you where none will think of venturing this night." So saying, they both arose, and soon hid from view amongst the rocks and caverns of the mountains. The conjecture of the peddler was true. Mason and his men dashed down the hill, in pursuit, as they supposed, of their victims, but on reaching the bottom lands they found only the deserted horses of the fugitives. Some little time was spent in examining the woods near them, and endeavoring to take the trail on such ground as might enable the horse to pursue, when one of the party descried the peddler and Henry seated on the rock already mentioned. "He's off," muttered Mason, eyeing Harvey with a fury. "He's off, and we are disgraced. By heavens, Washington will not trust us with keeping of a suspect Tory, if we let the rascal trifle in this manner and with the corps. And there sits the Englishman, too, looking down upon us with a smile of benevolence. I fancy that I can see it. Well, well, my lad, you are comfortably seated, I will confess, and that is something better than dancing upon nothing. But you are not to the west of Harlem River yet, and I will try your wind before you tell Sir Henry what you have seen." "Shall I fire and frighten the peddler?" asked one of the men, drawing his pistol from the holster. "Aye, startle the birds from their perch. Let us see how they can use the wing." The man fired the pistol, and Mason continued, "For George, I believe the scoundrels laugh at us. But homeward, or we shall have them rolling stones upon our heads, and the Royal Gazettes teemed with an account of the rebel regiment routed by 2 loyalists. They have told bigger lies than that before now." The dragoons moved sullenly after their officer, who rode towards their quarters, musing on the course it behooved him to pursue in the present dilemma. It was twilight when Mason's party reached a dwelling, before the door of which was collected a great number of the officers and men, busily employed in giving and listening to the most exaggerated accounts of the escape of the spy. The mortified dragoons gave their ungrateful tidings with the sullen air of disappointed men, and most of the officers gathered round Mason, to consult of the steps that ought to be taken. Miss Peyton and Frances were breathless and unobserved listeners to all that passed between them, from the window of the chamber immediately above their heads. "Something must be done, and that speedily," observed the commanding officer of the regiment, which lay encamped before the house. "This English officer is doubtless an instrument in the great blow aimed at us by the enemy lately. Besides, our honor is involved in his escape." "Let us beat the woods!" cried several at once. "By morning we shall have them both again." "Softly, softly, gentlemen," returned the colonel. "No man can travel these hills after dark unless used to the passes. Nothing but horse can do service in this business, and I presume Lieutenant Mason hesitates to move without the orders of his major." "I certainly dare not," replied the subaltern, gravely shaking his head, "unless you will take responsibility of an order. But Major Dunwoodie will be back again in 2 hours, and we can carry the tidings through the hills before daylight, so that by spreading patrols across from one river to the other, and offering a reward to the country people, their escape will yet be impossible, unless they can join the party that is said to be out of the Hudson." "A very plausible plan," cried the colonel, "and one that must succeed. But let a messenger be dispatched to Dunwoodie, or he may continue at the ferry until it proves too late, though doubtless the runaways will lie in the mountains tonight." To this suggestion Mason acquiesced, and a courier was sent to the major with the important intelligence of the escape of Henry, and an intimation of the necessity of his presence to conduct the pursuit. After this arrangement the officers separated. When Miss Peyton and her niece first learned the escape of Captain Wharton, it was with difficulty that they could credit their senses. They both relied so implicitly on the success of Dunwoodie's exertions, that they thought the act, on the part of the relative, extremely imprudent. But it was now too late to mend it. When listening to the conversation of the officers, both were struck with the increased danger of Henry's situation, if recaptured, and they trembled to think of the great exertions that would be made to accomplish this object. Miss Peyton consoled herself and endeavored to cheer her niece with the probability that the fugitives would pursue their course with unremitting diligence, so that they might reach the neutral ground before the horse would carry down the tidings of their flight. The absence of Dunwoodie seemed to her all important, and the artless lady was anxiously devising some project that might detain her kinsman, and thus give her nephew the longest possible time. But very different were the reflections of Frances. She could no longer doubt that the figure she had seen on the hill was Birch, and she felt certain that instead of flying to the friendly forces below, her brother would be taken to the mysterious hut to pass the night. Frances and her aunt led a long and animated discussion by themselves, when the good spinster reluctantly yielded to the representation of her niece, and folding her in her arms, she kissed her cold cheek, and fervently blessing her, allowed her to depart on an errand of fraternal love. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30. In here forlorn and lost I tread, with fainting steps and slow, where wilds immeasurably spread seem lengthening as I go. The night had set in dark and chilling, as Frances Wharton, with a beating heart but light step, moved through the little garden that lay behind the farmhouse which had been her brother's prison, and took her way to the foot of the mountain, where she had seen the figure of him she supposed to be the peddler. It was still early, but the darkness and the dreary nature of a November evening would, at any other moment, or with less inducement to exertion, have driven her back in terror to the circle she had left. Without pausing to reflect, however, she flew over the ground with a rapidity that seemed to bid defiance to all impediments, nor stopped even to breathe until she had gone half the distance to the rock that she had marked as the spot where Birch made his appearance on that very morning. The good treatment of their women is the surest evidence that a people can give of their civilization, and there is no nation which has more to boast of it in this respect than the Americans. Frances felt but little apprehension from the orderly and quiet troops who were taking their evening's repast on the side of the highway, opposite to the field through which she was flying. They were her countrymen, and she knew that her sex would be respected by the Eastern militia, who composed this body, but in the volatile and reckless character of the Southern horse she had less confidence. Outrages of any description were seldom committed by the really American soldiery, but she recoiled with exquisite delicacy from even the appearance of humiliation. When therefore she heard the footsteps of a horse moving slowly up the road, she shrank timidly into a little thicket of wood which grew around the spring that bubbled from the side of a hillock near her. The vidette, for such it proved to be, passed her without noticing her form, which was so enveloped as to be as little conspicuous as possible. Humming a low air to himself, and probably thinking of some other fare that he had left on the banks of Potomac, Frances listened anxiously to the retreating footsteps of his horse, and as they died upon her ear she ventured from her place of secrecy, and advanced a short distance to the field, where, startled at the gloom and appalled with the dreariness of the prospect, she paused to reflect on what she had undertaken. Throwing back the hood of her cardinal, she sought the support of a tree, and gazed towards the summit of the mountain that was to be the goal of her enterprise. It rose from the plain like a huge pyramid, giving nothing to the eye but its outline. The pinnacle could be faintly discerned in front of a lighter background of clouds, between which a few glimmering stars occasionally twinkled in the momentary brightness, and then gradually became obscured by the passing vapor that was moving before the wind at a very distance below the clouds themselves. Should she return, Henry and the peddler would most probably pass the night in fancied security upon the very hill towards which she was straining her eyes, in the vain hope of observing some light that might encourage her to proceed. The deliberate, and what to her seemed cold-blooded, project of the officer for the recapture of the fugitives still rang in her ears, and stimulated her to go on, but the solitude into which she must venture, the time, the actual danger of the ascent, and the uncertainty of her finding the hut, or what was still more disheartening, the chance that it might be occupied by unknown tenants, and those of the worst description, urged her to retreat. The increasing darkness was each moment rendering objects less and less distinct, and the clouds were gathering more gloomily in the rear of the hill, until its form could no longer be discerned. Frances threw back her rich curls with both hands on her temples, in order to possess her senses in their utmost keenness. But the towering hill was entirely lost to the eye. At length she discovered a faint and twinkling blaze in the direction in which she thought the building stood, that, by its reviving and receding luster, might be taken for the glimmering of a light. But the delusion vanished, as the horizon again cleared, and the star of the evening shone forth from a cloud, after struggling hard, as if for existence. She now saw the mountain to the left of the place where the planet was shining, and suddenly a streak of mellow light burst upon the fantastic oaks that were thinly scattered over its summit, and gradually moved down its side until the whole pile became distinct under the rays of the rising moon. Although it would have been physically impossible for our heroine to advance without the aid of the friendly light, which now gleamed on the long line of level land before her, yet she was not encouraged to proceed. If she could see the goal of her wishes, she could also perceive the difficulties that must attend her reaching it. While deliberate in distressing incertitude, now shrinking with the timidity of her sex and years from the enterprise, and now resolving to rescue her brother at every hazard, Frances turned her looks towards the east, in the earnest gaze at the clouds which constantly threatened to involve her again in comparative darkness. Had an adder stung her, she could not have sprung with greater celerity than she recoiled from the object against which she was leaning, and which she for the first time noticed. The two upright posts, with a crossbeam on their tops, and a rude platform beneath, told but too plainly the nature of the structure. Even the cord was suspended from the iron staple, and was swinging to and fro in the night air. Frances hesitated no longer, but rather flew than ran across the meadow, and was soon at the base of the rock, where she hoped to find something like a path to the summit of the mountain. Here she was compelled to pause for breath, and was improved the leisure by surveying the ground about her. The ascent was quite abrupt, but she soon found a sheep path that wound among the shelving rocks and through the trees, so as to render her labor much less tiresome than it otherwise would have been. Throwing a fearful glance behind, the determined girl commenced her journey upwards. Young, active, and impelled by her generous motive, she moved up the hill with elastic steps, and very soon emerged from the cover of the woods into an open space of more level ground, that had evidently been cleared of its timber for the purpose of cultivation. But either the war or the sterility of the soil had compelled the adventurer to abandon the advantages that had been obtained over the wilderness, and already the brushes and the briars were springing up afresh, as if the plough had never traced furrows through the mold which nourished them. Frances felt her spirits invigorated by the faint vestiges of the labor of man, and she walked up the gentle acclivity with renewed hopes of success. The path now diverged in so many different directions that she soon saw it would be useless to follow their windings, and abandoned it at the first turn. She labored forward towards what she thought was the nearest point of the summit. The cleared ground was soon passed, and the woods and rocks clinging to the precipitous sides of the mountain again opposed themselves to her progress. Occasionally the path was seen running along the verge of the clearing, then striking off into the scattered patches of grass and herbage, but in no instance could she trace it upward. Tufts of wool hanging to the briars sufficiently denoted the origin of these tracks, and Frances rightly conjectured that whoever descended the mountain would avail himself of their existence to lighten the labor. Seating herself on a stone, the wearied girl again paused to rest and to reflect. The clouds were rising before the moon, and the whole scene at her feet lay pictured in softest colors. The white tents of the militia were stretched in regular lines immediately beneath her. The light was shining in the window of her aunt, who Frances easily fancied was watching the mountain, racked with all the anxiety she might be supposed to feel for her niece. Lanterns were playing about in the stable yard, and where she knew the horses of the dragoons were kept, and believing them to be preparing for their night march, she again sprang upon her feet and renewed her toil. Our heroine had to ascend more than a quarter of a mile farther, although she had already conquered 2/3 of the height of the mountain. But she was now without a path, or any guide to direct her in her course. Fortunately, the hill was conical, like most of the mountains in that range, and by advancing upwards, she was certain of at any length reaching the desired hut, which hung, as it were, on the very pinnacle. Nearly an hour did she struggle with the numerous difficulties that she was obliged to overcome, when, having reached exhaustively with her efforts, and in several instances in great danger from falls, she succeeded in gaining the small piece of tableland on the summit. Faint with exertions which had been unusually severe for so slight a frame, she sank on a rock to recover her strength and fortitude of the approaching interview. A few moments sufficed for this purpose, when she proceeded in quest of the hut. All of the neighboring hills were distinctly visible by the aid of the moon, and Frances was able, where she stood, to trace the route of the highway from the plains into the mountains. By following this line with her eyes, she soon discovered the point whence she had seen the mysterious dwelling, and directly opposite to that point she well knew the hut must stand. The chilling air sighed through the leafless branches of the gnarled and crooked oaks, as with a step so light as hardly to rustle the dry leaves on which she trod. Frances moved forward to that part of the hill where she expected to find this secluded habitation, but nothing could she discern that in the least resembled a dwelling of any sort. In vain she examined every recess of the rocks, or inquisitively explored every part of the summit that she thought could hold the tenant of the peddler. No hut nor any vestige of a human being could she trace. The idea of her solitude struck on the terrified mind of the affrighted girl, and approaching to the edge of a shelving rock, she bent forward to gaze on the signs of life in the vale, where a ray of keen light dazzled her eyes, and a warm ray diffused itself over her whole frame. Recovering from her surprise, Frances looked on the ledge beneath her, and at once perceived that she stood directly over the object of her search. A hole through its roof provided a passage to the smoke, which, as it blew aside, showed her a clear and cheerful fire crackling and snapping on a rude hearth of stone. The approach to the front of the hut was by a winding path around the point of the rock on which she stood, and by this she advanced to its door. Three sides of this singular edifice, if such it could be called, were composed of logs laid alternately on each other to a little more than the height of a man, and the fourth was formed by the rock against which it leaned. The roof was made of the bark of trees, laid in long strips from the rock to its eaves. The fissures between the logs had been stuffed with clay, which in many places had fallen out, and dried leaves were made use of as a substitute, to keep out the wind. A single window of 4 panes of glass was in the front, but a board carefully closed it in such a manner as to admit no light from the fire within. After pausing some time to view this singularly constructed hiding-place, for such Frances knew it well, she applied her eye to a crevice to examine the inside. There was no lamp or candle, but the blazing fire of dry wood made the interior of the hut light enough to be read by. In one corner lay a bed of straw with a pair of blankets thrown carelessly over it, as if left where it had been last used. Against the wall and rock were suspended, from pegs forced into the crevices, various garments, and such as were apparently fitted for all ages and conditions, and for either sex. British and American uniforms hung peaceably by the side of each other, and on the peg that supported a gown of striped calico, such as was the unusual country wear, was also depending a well-powdered wig. In short, the attire was numerous, and as various as if a whole parish were to be equipped from this one wardrobe. In the angle against the rock, and the opposite to the fire which was burning in the other corner, was an open cupboard, and that held a plate or two, a mug, and the remains of some broken meat. Before the fire was a table, with one of its legs fractured, and made of rough boards. These, with a single stool, composed the furniture, if we except a few articles of cooking. A book by its size and shape appeared to be a Bible, was lying on the table unopened, but it was the occupant and the hut in whom Frances was chiefly interested. This was a man sitting on the stool with his head leaning on his hand, in such a manner as to conceal his features, and deeply occupied in examining some open papers. On the table lay a pair of curiously and richly mounted horseman's pistols, and the handle of a sheathed rapier, of exquisite workmanship, protruded from between the legs of the gentleman, one of whose hands carelessly rested on its guard. The tall stature of this unexpected tenant of the hut, and his form, much more athletic than that of either Harvey or her brother, told Frances, without the aid of his dress, that it was neither of those she sought. A close surtout was buttoned tight in the throat of the stranger, and parted at his knees, showed breeches of a buff, with military boots and spurs. His hair was dressed so as to expose the whole face, and after the fashion of the day it was profusely powdered. A round hat was laid on the stones that formed a paved floor to the hut, as if to make room for a large map, which, among the other papers, occupied the table. This was an unexpected event to our adventurer. She had been so confident that the figure twice seen was the peddler, that on learning that his agency in her brother's escape, she did not in the least doubt of finding them both in the place where she now discovered was occupied by another and a stranger. She stood earnestly looking through the crevice, hesitating whether to retire, or to wait with the expectation of meeting Henry, as the stranger moved his hand from before his eyes and raised his face, apparently in deep musing, when Frances instantly recognized the benevolent and strongly marked but composed features of Harper. All that Dunwoodie had said of his power and disposition, all that he had himself promised her brother, and all the confidence that had been created by his dignified and paternal manner, rushed across the mind of Frances, who threw open the door of the hut, and falling at his feet, clasped his knees with her arms, and she cried,— "Save him! Save him! Save my brother! Remember your promise, and save him!" Harper had risen as the door opened, and there was a slight movement of one hand towards his pistols, but it was cool and instantly checked. He raised the hood of the cardinal, which had fallen over her features, and exclaimed with some uneasiness,— "Miss Wharton, but you cannot be alone!" "There is none here but my God and you, and by his sacred name I conjure you to remember your promise and save my brother." Harper gently raised her from her knees and placed her on the stool, begging her at the same time to be composed, and to acquaint him with the nature of her errand. This Frances instantly did, ingenuously admitting him to the knowledge of all her views in visiting that lone spot at such an hour and by herself. It was at all times difficult to probe the thoughts of one who held his passions in such disciplined subjection as Harper, but still there was a lighting of his thoughtful eye, and a slight unbending of his muscles, as the hurried and anxious girl proceeded in her narrative. His interest, as she dwelt upon the manner of Henry's escape and the flight to the woods, was deep and manifest, and he listened to the remainder of her tale with a marked expression of benevolent indulgence. Her apprehensions that her brother might still be too late through the mountains seemed to have much weight with him, for, as she concluded, he walked a turn through the hut, in silent musing. Frances hesitated, and unconsciously played with the handle of one of the pistols, and the paleness that her fears had spread over her fine features began to give place to a rich tint, as after a short pause she added,— "We cannot depend much on the friendship of Major Dunwoodie, but his sense of honor is so pure, that notwithstanding his feelings, his desire to serve us, he will conceive it to be his duty to apprehend my brother again. Besides, he thinks there will be no danger in doing so, as he relies greatly on your interference." "Oh, mine?" said Harper, raising his eyes in surprise. "Yes, on yours. When we told him of your kind language, he at once assured us all that you had the power, and if you had promised, would have the inclination to procure Henry's pardon." "Said he more?" asked Harper, who appeared slightly uneasy. "Nothing but reiterated assurances of Henry's safety. Even now he is in quest of you. Miss Wharton, that I bear no mean part in the unhappy struggle between England and America, I might now be useless to deny. You owe your brother's escape this night to my knowledge of his innocence, and the remembrance of my word. Major Dunwoodie is mistaken when he says that I might openly have procured his pardon. I now, indeed, can control his fate, and I pledge to you a word that has some influence with Washington, that means shall be taken to prevent his recapture. But from you, also, I exact a promise, that this interview, and all that has passed between us, remain confined to your own bosom, until you have my permission to speak upon the subject." Frances gave the desired assurance, and he continued,— "The peddler and your brother will soon be here, but I must not be seen by the royal officer, or the life of Birch might be the forfeiture." "Never!" cried Frances ardently. "Henry could never be so base as to betray the man who saved him." "It is no childish game that we are now playing, Miss Wharton. Men's lives and fortunes hang upon slender threads, and nothing must be left to accident that we can guard against. Did Sir Henry Clinton know that the peddler had communion with me, and under such circumstances the life of the miserable man would be taken instantly. Therefore, as you value human blood, or remember the rescue of your brother, be prudent, and be silent. Communicate what you know to them both, and urge them to instantly departure. If they can reach the last pickets of our army before morning, it shall be my care there are none to intercept them. There is better work for Major Dunwoodie than to exposing the life of his friend." While Harper was speaking, he carefully rolled up the map he had been studying, and placed it, together with sundry papers that were also open, into his pocket. He was still occupied in this manner, when the voice of the peddler, talking in unusually loud tones, was heard directly over their heads. "Stand further this way, Captain Wharton, and you can see the tents in the moonshine. Let them mount and ride. I have a nest here that will hold us both, and we will go in at our leisure." "And where is this nest? I confess that I have eaten but little the last 2 days, and I crave some of your cheer you mention." "Humph!" said the peddler, exerting his voice still more. "This fog has given me a cold, but move slowly, and be careful not to slip, or you may land on the bayonet of the sentinel on the flats. 'Tis a steep hill to rise, but one can go down it with ease." Harper pressed his finger on his lip to remind Frances of her promise, and taking his pistols and hat so that no vestige of his visit remained, he retired deliberately to a far corner of the hut, where, lifting several articles of dress, he entered a recess in the rock, and letting them fall again, was hidden from view. Frances noticed, by the strong firelight as he entered, that it was a natural cavity, and contained nothing but a few more articles of domestic use. The surprise of Henry and the peddler of entering, and finding Frances in possession of the hut, may be easily imagined. Without waiting for the explanation or questions, the warm-hearted girl flew into the arms of her brother, and gave a vent to her emotions in tears. But the peddler seemed struck with very different feelings. His first look was at the fire, which had been recently supplied with fuel. He then drew upon a small drawer of the table, and looked a little alarmed at finding it empty. "Are you alone, Miss Fanny?" he asked in a quick voice. "You did not come here alone?" "As you see me, Mr. Birch," said Frances, raising herself from her brother's arms, and turning an expressive glance towards the secret cavern, and the quick eye of the peddler instantly understood. "But why and wherefore are you here?" exclaimed her astonished brother. "And how knew you of this place at all?" Frances entered at once into a brief detail of what had occurred at the house since their departure, and the motives which induced her to seek them. "But," said Birch, "why follow us here, when we were left on the opposite hill?" Frances related the glimpse that she had caught of the hut and the peddler, in her passage through the Highlands, and as well as her view of him on that day, and her immediate conjecture that the fugitives would seek the shelter of this habitation for the night. Birch examined her features as, with open ingenuousness, she related the simple incidents that had made her mistress of this secret; and as she ended, he sprang upon his feet, and striking the window with his stick in his hand, demolished it at a blow. "'Tis but little luxury or comfort that I know," he said, "but even that little cannot be enjoyed in safety, Miss Wharton," he added, advancing before Frances, and speaking with the bitter melancholy that was common to him. "I am hunted through these hills like the beast of the forest, but whenever I, tired with my toils, I can reach this spot, poor and dreary as it is, I can spend my solitary nights in safety." Will you aid to make the life of a wretch still more miserable?" "Never!" cried Frances, with fervor. "Your secret is safe with me." "Major Dunwoodie," said the peddler, slowly turning an eye upon her that read her soul. Frances lowered her head upon her bosom, for a moment, in shame; then elevating her fine and glowing face, she added with enthusiasm, "Never, never, Harvey, as God may hear my prayers!" The peddler seemed satisfied as he drew back, and, watching his opportunity, unseen by Henry, slipped behind the screen, and entered the cavern. Frances and her brother, who thought his companion had passed through the door, continued conversing on the latter's situation for several minutes, when the former urged the necessity of expedition on his part, in order to precede Dunwoodie, from whose sense of duty they knew they had no escape. The captain took out his pocket-book, wrote a few lines with his pencil, then folding the paper, he handed it to his sister. "Frances," he said, "you have this night proved yourself to be an incomparable woman, and as you love me, give that unopened to Dunwoodie, and remember that 2 hours may save my life." "I will, but why delay? Why not fly and improve those precious moments?" "Your sister says well, Captain Wharton," exclaimed Harvey, who had re-entered unseen. "We must go at once. Here is food to eat as we travel." "But who is to see this fair creature in safety?" cried the captain. "I can never desert my sister in such a place as this." Leave me," said Frances. "I can descend as I came up. Do not doubt me. You know not my courage nor my strength." "I have not known you, dear girl, it is true; but now, as I learn your value, can I quit you here? Never, never!" "Captain Wharton," said Birch, throwing open the door, "you can trifle with your own lives, if you have many to spare, but I have but one, and must nurse it. Do I go alone or not?" Go, dear Henry," said Frances, embracing him. "Go, remember our father, remember Sarah." She waited not for his answer, but gently forced him through the door, and closed it with her own hands. For a short time there was a warm debate between Henry and the peddler, but the latter finally prevailed, and the breathless girl heard the successive plunges as they went down the sides of the mountain at a rapid rate. Immediately after the noise of their departure had ceased, Harper reappeared. He took the arm of Frances in silence, and led her from the hut. The way seemed familiar to him, for, ascending to the ledge above them, he led his companion across the tableland tenderly, pointing out the little difficulties in their route, and cautioning her against injury. Frances felt, as she walked by the side of this extraordinary man, that she was supported by one of no common stamp. The firmness of his step and the composure of his manner seemed to indicate a mind settled and resolved. By taking a route over the back of the hill, they descended with great expedition, and but little danger. The distance it had taken Frances an hour to conquer was passed by Harper and his companion in 10 minutes, and they entered the open space already mentioned. He struck into one of the sheep paths, and, crossing the clearing with rapid steps, they came suddenly upon a horse, caparisoned for a rider of no mean rank. The noble beast snorted and pawed the earth as his master approached, and replaced the pistols in the holsters. Harper then turned, and taking the hand of Frances, spoke as follows: "You have this night saved your brother, Miss Wharton. It would not be proper for me to explain why there are limits to my ability to serve him; but if you can detain the horse for 2 hours, he is assuredly safe. After what you have already done, I can believe you equal to any duty. God has denied to me children, young lady, but if it had been his blessed will that my marriage should not have been childless, such a treasure as yourself would I have asked from his mercy. But you are my child. All who dwell in this broad land are my children and my care, and take the blessing of one who hopes yet to meet you in happier days." As he spoke with a solemnity that touched Frances to the heart, he laid his hand impressively upon her head. The guileless girl turned her face towards him, and the hood again falling back, exposed her lovely features to the moonbeams. A tear was glistening on either cheek, and her mild blue eyes were glazed upon his reverence. Harper bent and pressed a paternal kiss upon her forehead, and continued, "Any of these sheep paths will take you to the plain, but here we must part. I have much to do and far to ride. Forget me in all but your prayers." He then mounted his horse, and lifting his hat, rode towards the back of the mountain, descending at the same time, and was soon hid by the trees. Frances sprang forward with a lightened heart, and taking the first path that led onwards, in a few minutes she reached a plain in safety. While busied in stealing through the meadows towards the house, the noise of horse approaching startled her, and she felt how much more was to be apprehended from man in such situations than from solitude. Hiding her form in the angle of a fence near the road, she remained quiet for a moment, and watched their passage. A small party of dragoons, whose dress was different from the Virginians, passed at a brisk trot. They were followed by a gentleman enveloped in a large cloak, whom she at once knew to be Harper. Behind him rode a black in livery, and two youths in uniform brought up the rear. Instead of taking the road that led by the encampment, they turned short to the left, and entered the hills. Wondering who this unknown but powerful friend of her brother ought to be, Frances glided across the fields, and, using due precautions in approaching the dwelling, regained her residence undiscovered and in safety. Chapter 30.